I don't know how much you know about brain-computer interfaces and Neuralink. The idea there is, our brains are very limited. And if we just we plug in, we provide a mechanism for a computer to speak with the brain. So you're thereby expanding the computational power of the brain. The possibilities there, sort of from a very high level philosophical perspective, is limitless. But I wonder how limitless it is. Are the constraints we have like features that are fundamental to our intelligence? Or is this just like this weird constraint in terms of our brain size and skull and lifespan and senses? Is just the weird little like quirk of evolution? And if we just open that up, like add much more senses, add much more computational power, the intelligence will expand exponentially. Do you have a sense about constraints, the relationship of evolution and computation to the constraints of the environment?
Well, at first, I'd like to comment on that, like changing the inputs to human brain
Yes,
and
that would be
flexibility of the brain. I think there's a lot of that. There are experiments that are done in animals, like Mikangasur at MIT, switching the auditory and visual information, and going to the wrong part of the cortex, and the animal was still able to hear and perceive the visual environment. And there are kids that are born with severe disorders, and sometimes they have to remove half of the brain, like one half, and they still grow up. They have the functions migrate to the other parts. There's a lot of flexibility like that. So I think it's quite possible to hook up the brain with different kinds of sensors, for instance, and something that we don't even quite understand or have today, different kind of wavelengths or whatever they are. And then the brain can learn to make sense of it. And that, I think, is there's good hope that these prosthetic devices, for instance, work, not because we make them so good and so easy to use, but the brain adapts to them and can learn to take advantage of them. And so in that sense, if there's a problem, I think that brain can be used to correct it. Now, going beyond what we have today, can you get smarter? That's really much harder to do. Giving the brain more input probably might overwhelm it. It would have to learn to filter it and focus, and in order to use the information effectively. And augmenting intelligence with some kind of external devices like that might be difficult, I think. But replacing what's lost, I think, is quite possible.
Right. So our intuition allows us to sort of imagine that we can replace what's been lost, but expansion beyond what we have. I mean, we are already one of the most, if not the most intelligent things on this earth, right? So it's hard to imagine if the brain can hold up with an order of magnitude greater set of information thrown at it, if it can reason through that. Part of me, this is the Russian thing, I think, is I tend to think that the limitations is where the superpower is. That, immortality and huge increase in bandwidth of information by connecting computers with the brain is not going to produce greater intelligence. It might produce lesser intelligence. So I don't know. There's something about the scarcity being essential to fitness or performance, but that could be just because we're so limited.
No, exactly. You make do with what you have, but you can. You don't have to pipe it directly to the brain. I mean, we already have devices like phones where we can look up information at any point.
Yeah,
and that can make us more productive. You don't have to argue about, I don't know, what happened in that baseball game or whatever it is, because you can look it up right away. And I think in that sense, we can learn to utilize tools, and that's what we have been doing for a long time. And we are already, the brain is already drinking from the water fire hose, like vision. There's way more information in the vision that we actually process. So brain is already good at identifying what matters. And that we can switch that from vision to some other wavelength or some other kind of modality, but I think that the same processing principles probably still apply. But also, indeed, this ability to have information more accessible and more relevant, I think, can enhance. what we do. I mean, kids today at school, they learn about DNA. I mean, things that were discovered just a couple of years ago, it's already common knowledge, and we are building on it. And we don't see a problem where there's too much information that we can absorb and learn. Maybe people become a little bit more narrow in what they know. They are in one field. But this information that we have accumulated, it is passed on, and people are picking up on it, and they are building on it. So it's not like we have reached the point of saturation. We have still this process that allows us to be selective and decide what's interesting. I think still works, even with the more information we have today.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about, like, Wikipedia becoming a sensor, like so the fire hose of information from Wikipedia. So it's like you integrate it directly into the brain to where you're thinking, like you're observing the world with all of Wikipedia directly piping into your brain. So like when I see a light, I immediately have like the history of who invented electricity, like integrated very quickly into. So just the way you think about the world might be very interesting if you can integrate that kind of information. What are your thoughts, if I could ask, on early steps on the Neuralink side? I don't know if you got a chance to see, but there's a monkey playing Pong through the brain-computer interface. And the dream there is sort of, you're already replacing the thumbs, essentially, that you would use to play a video game. The dream is to be able to increase further the interface by which you interact with the computer. Are you impressed by this? Are you worried about this? What are your thoughts as a human?
I think it's wonderful. I think it's great that we could do something like that. I mean, there are devices that read your EEG, for instance, and humans can learn to control things using just their thoughts in that sense. And I don't think it's that different. I mean, those signals would go to limbs, they would go to thumbs. Now the same signals go through a sensor to some computing system. It still probably has to be built on human terms, not to overwhelm them, but utilize what's there and sense the right kind of patterns that are easy to generate. But that I think is really quite possible and wonderful, and could be very much more efficient.
It'd be great if you can sort of comment. I got a chance recently to spend a day at a company called Neuralink that uses brain-computer interfaces, and their dream is to, well, there's a bunch of sort of dreams, but one of them is to understand the brain by sort of, getting in there past the so-called sort of factory wall, getting in there and be able to listen, communicate both directions. What are your thoughts about this, the future of this kind of technology of brain-computer interfaces, to be able to now have a window or direct contact within the brain to be able to measure some of the signals, to be able to send signals, to understand some of the functionality of the brain?
Ambivalent. My sense is ambivalent. So it's a mixture of good and bad, and I acknowledge that freely. So the good bits, if you just look at the legacy of that kind of reciprocal but invasive brain stimulation, I didn't paint a complete picture when I was talking about the ways we understand the brain prior to neuroimaging. It wasn't just lesion deficit studies. Some of the early work, in fact, literally 100 yards from where we're sitting at the Institute of Neurology, was done by stimulating the brain of, say, dogs, and looking at how they responded, either with their muscles or with their salivation, and imputing what that part of the brain must be doing. That if I stimulate it, then and I evoke this kind of response, then that tells me quite a lot about the functional specialization. So there's a long history of brain stimulation, which continues to enjoy a lot of attention nowadays.
Positive attention?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease is now a standard treatment, and also a wonderful vehicle to try and understand the neuronal dynamics that underlie movement disorders like Parkinson's disease. Even interest in magnetic stimulation, stimulating with magnetic fields, and will it work in people who are depressed, for example? Quite a crude level of understanding what you're doing, but there is historical evidence that these kinds of brute force interventions do change things. It's a little bit like banging the TV when the valves aren't working properly, but it works. There is a long history. Brain-computer interfacing, or BCI, I think is a beautiful example of that. It's sort of carved out its own niche and its own aspirations, and there have been enormous advances within limits. Advances in terms of our ability to understand how the embodied brain, engages with the world. I'm thinking here of sensory substitution, the augmenting our sensory capacities by giving ourselves extra ways of sensing and sampling the world, ranging from sort of trying to replace lost visual signals through to giving people completely new signals. So one of the, I think, most engaging examples of this is equipping people with a sense of magnetic fields. Mm-hmm. So you can actually give them magnetic sensors that enable them to feel, should we say, tactile pressure around their tummy, where they are in relation to the magnetic field of the Earth.
That's incredible.
And after a few weeks, they take it for granted. They integrate it, they imbibe, they assimilate this new sensory information into the way that they literally feel their world, but now equipped with this sense of magnetic direction. So that tells you something about the brain's plastic potential to remodel and its plastic capacity to suddenly try to explain the sensory data at hand by augmenting the sensory sphere and the kinds of things that you can measure. Clearly, that's purely for entertainment and understanding the nature and the power of our brains. I would imagine that most BCI is pitched at solving clinical and human problems such as locked-in syndrome, such as paraplegia, or replacing lost sensory capacities like blindness and deafness. So then we come to the the negative part of my ambivalence, the other side of it. I don't want to be deflationary, because much of my deflationary comments is probably largely out of ignorance than anything else. But generally speaking, the bandwidth and the bit rates that you get from brain-computer interfaces as we currently know them, we're talking about bits per second. Yeah. So that would be like me only being able to communicate with any world or with you using very, very, very slow Morse code. And it is not even within an order of magnitude near what we actually need for an inactive realization of what people aspire to when they think about sort of curing people with paraplegia or replacing sight, despite heroic efforts. So one has to ask, is there a lower bound on the kinds of recurrent information exchange between a brain and some augmented or artificial interface? And then we come back to, interestingly, what I was talking about before, which is, if you're talking about function in terms of inference, and I presume we'll get to that later on in terms of the free energy principle, but at the moment, there may be fundamental reasons to assume that is the case. We're talking about ensemble activity. We're talking about basically, for example, let's paint the challenge facing brain-computer interfacing in terms of controlling another system that is highly and deeply structured, very relevant to our lives, very non-linear, that rests upon the kind of non-equilibrium steady states and dynamics that the brain does, the weather. All right? So,
good example, yeah.
Imagine you had some very aggressive satellites that could produce signals that could perturb some little parts of the weather system. And then what you're asking now is, can I meaningfully get into the weather and change it meaningfully and make the weather respond in a way that I want it to? Mm-hmm. You're talking about chaos control on a scale which is almost unimaginable. So there may be fundamental reasons why BCI, as you might read about it in a science fiction novel, aspirational BCI may never actually work, in the sense that to really be integrated and be part of the system is a requirement that requires you to have evolved with that system. That you have to be part of a very delicately structured, deeply structured, dynamic ensemble activity that is not like rewiring a broken computer or plugging in a peripheral interface adapter. It is much more like getting into the weather patterns, or come back to your magic soup, getting into the active matter and meaningfully relate that to the outside world. So I think there are enormous challenges there.
So I think the example of the weather is a brilliant one. And I think you paint a really interesting picture. And it wasn't as negative as I thought. It's essentially saying that it might be incredibly challenging, including the low bound of the bandwidth and so on. So just to full disclosure, I come from the machine learning world. So my natural thought is the hardest part is the engineering challenge of controlling the weather, of getting those satellites up and running and so on. And once they are, then the rest is fundamentally the same approaches that allow you to win in the game of Go will allow you to potentially play in this soup, in this chaos. Mm-hmm. So I have a hope that sort of machine learning methods will help us play in this soup. But perhaps you're right that it is biology in the brain is just an incredible system that may be almost impossible to get in. But for me, what seems impossible is the incredible mess of blood vessels that you also described. Without, we also value the brain. You can't make any mistakes. You can't damage things. So to me, that engineering challenge seems nearly impossible. One of the things I was really impressed by at Neuralink is just talking to brilliant neurosurgeons and the roboticists, that it made me realize that even though it seems impossible, if anyone can do it, it's some of these world-class engineers that are trying to take it on. So I think the conclusion of our discussion here is of this part is basically that the problem is really hard, but hopefully not impossible.
Absolutely.
So if it's okay,
go there.
So that's sort of artificial intelligence and technology augmenting our intelligence as humans. Yesterday, a company called Neuralink announced they did this whole demonstration. I don't know if you saw it. It's they demonstrated brain-machine interface, where there's like a sewing machine for the brain. Do you a lot of that is quite out there in terms of things that some people would say are impossible, but they're dreamers and want to engineer systems like that. Do you see, based on what you just said, a hope for that more direct interaction with the brain?
I think there are different ways. One is a direct interaction with the brain. And again, there are lots of companies that work in this space. And I think there will be a lot of developments. But I'm just thinking that many times we are not aware of our feelings of motivation, what drives us. Like, let me give you a trivial example, our attention. There are a lot of studies that demonstrate that it takes a while to a person to understand that they are not attentive anymore. And we know that there are people who really have strong capacity to hold attention. There are another end of the spectrum, people with ADD and other issues that they have problem to regulate their attention. Imagine to yourself that you have like a cognitive aid that just alerts you based on your gaze, that your attention is now not on what you are doing. And instead of writing a paper, you're now dreaming of what you're going to do in the evening. So even this kind of simple measurement things, how they can change us. And I see it even in simple ways with myself. I have my Zone app from that I got in MIT gym. It kind of records, how much did you run, and you have some points, and you can get some status, whatever. Like I said, what is this ridiculous thing? Who would ever care about some status in some app? Guess what? So to maintain the status, you have to do certain number of points every month. And not only that I do it every single month for the last 18 months, it went to the point that I was running, that I was injured. And when I could run again, in 2 days, I did like some humongous amount of running just to complete the points.
Oh, no.
It was like really not safe.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not going to lose my status because I want to get there. So you can already see that this direct measurement and the feedback is, we're looking at video games and see why, the addiction aspect of it, but you can imagine that the same idea can be expanded to many other areas of our life when we really can get feedback. And imagine in your case, in relations, when we are doing keyword matching, imagine that the person who is generating the keywords, that person gets direct feedback before the whole thing explodes. That maybe at this happy point, we are going in the wrong direction. Maybe it will be really a behavior modifying moment.
So yeah, it's relationship management too. So yeah, that's a fascinating whole area of psychology actually as well, of seeing how our behavior has changed with basically all human relations now have other non-human entities helping us out. On the human side, there's this incredible general malleability, plasticity of the human brain. The human brain adapts, adjusts, and so on. So
that's not that plastic, to be totally frank.
So there's a firm structure, but nevertheless, there is some plasticity. And the open question is, sort of, if I could ask a broad question, is how much that plasticity can be utilized. Sort of on the human side, there's some plasticity in the human brain. And on the machine side, we have neural networks, machine learning, artificial intelligence. It's able to adjust and figure out signals. So there's a mysterious language that we don't perfectly understand that's within the human brain. And then we're trying to understand that language to communicate both directions. So the brain is adjusting a little bit. We don't know how much. And the machine is adjusting. Where do you see, as they try to sort of reach together, almost like with an alien species, try to find a protocol, communication protocol that works, where do you see the biggest benefit arriving from, on the machine side or the human side? Do you see both of them working together?
I actually think the machine side is far more malleable than the biological side by a huge amount. So it will be the machine that adapts to the brain. That's the only thing that's possible. The brain can't adapt that well to the machine. You can't have neurons start to regard an electrode as another neuron, because like neuron there's like the pulse, and so something else is pulsing. So there is that elasticity in the interface, which we believe is something that can happen, but the vast majority of the malleability will have to be on the machine side.
But it's interesting when you look at that synaptic plasticity at the interface side, there might be like an emergent plasticity, because it's it's not like in the brain, it's a whole nother extension of the brain. We might have to redefine what it means to be malleable for the brain. So maybe the brain is able to adjust to external interfaces.
There will be some adjustment to the brain, because there's going to be something reading and simulating the brain, and so it will adjust to that thing. But the vast majority of the adjustment will be on the machine side. It has to be that, otherwise it will not work. Ultimately, we currently operate on two layers. We have sort of a limbic, like primitive brain layer, which is where all of our kind of impulses are coming from. It's sort of like we've got like a monkey brain with a computer stuck on it. That's the human brain. And a lot of our impulses and everything are driven by the monkey brain. And the computer, the cortex, is constantly trying to make the monkey brain happy. It's not the cortex that's steering the monkey brain. It's the monkey brain steering the cortex. But
the cortex is the part that tells the story of the whole thing. So we convince ourselves it's more interesting than just the monkey brain.
The cortex is like what we call like human intelligence. So it's like that's like the advanced computer relative to other creatures. Other creatures do not have either. Really, they don't have the computer, or they have a very weak computer relative to humans. But it's like it sort of seems like surely the really smart thing should control the dumb thing, but actually the dumb thing controls the smart thing.
So do you think some of the same kind of machine learning methods, or whether that's natural language processing applications, are going to be applied for the communication between the machine and the brain to learn how to do certain things like movement of the body, how to process visual stimuli, and so on? Do you see the value of using machine learning to understand the language of the two-way communication with the brain?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're a neural net, and that, AI is basically neural net. So it's like digital neural net will interface with biological neural net, and hopefully bring us along for the ride. But the vast majority of our intelligence will be digital. This is think of like the difference in intelligence between the cortex and your limbic system is gigantic. Your limbic system really has no comprehension of what the hell the cortex is doing. It's just literally hungry, or tired, or angry, or sexy, or something. That communicates that impulse to the cortex and tells the cortex to go satisfy that. So then a great deal of like a massive amount of thinking, like truly stupendous amount of thinking, has gone into sex. Yeah. Without purpose, without procreation, which is actually quite a silly action in the absence of procreation. It's a bit silly. Well, so why are you doing it? Because it makes the limbic system happy. That's why. But it's pretty absurd, really.
Well, the whole of existence is pretty absurd in some kind of sense.
Yeah. But I mean, this is a lot of computation has gone into how can I do more of that with procreation not even being a factor. This is, I think, a very important area of research by NSFW.
An agency that should receive a lot of funding, especially after this conversation.
I propose the formation of a new agency.
Oh, boy. What is the most exciting, or some of the most exciting things that you see in the future impact of Neuralink, both on the science, the engineering, and societal broad impact?
So Neuralink, I think, at first will solve a lot of brain-related diseases. So it could be anything from like autism, schizophrenia, memory loss. Like everyone experiences memory loss at certain points in age. Parents can't remember their kids' names and that kind of thing. So there's, I think, a tremendous amount of good that Neuralink can do in solving critical damage to the brain or the spinal cord. There's a lot that can be done to improve quality of life of individuals, and those will be steps along the way. And then ultimately, it's intended to address the risk, the existential risk associated with digital superintelligence. Like we will not be able to be smarter than a digital supercomputer. So therefore, if you cannot beat them, join them. And at least we want to have that option.
So you have hope that Neuralink will be able to be a kind of connection to allow us to merge, to ride the wave of the improving AI systems?
I think the chance is above 0%.
So it's non-zero.
Yes.
There's a chance. And that's...
so have you seen Dumb and Dumber?
Yes.
So I'm saying there's a chance.
You're saying 1 in a billion or 1 in a million, whatever it was in Dumb and Dumber.
It went from maybe 1 in a million to improving. Maybe it'll be 1 in 1,000, and then 1 in 100, then 1 in 10. It depends on the rate of improvement of Neuralink and how fast we're able to make progress,
Well, I've talked to a few folks here that are quite brilliant engineers, so I'm excited.
Yeah, I think it's like fundamentally good, giving somebody back full motor control after they've had a spinal cord injury, restoring brain functionality after a stroke, solving debilitating genetically oriented brain diseases. These are all incredibly great, I think. And in order to do these, you have to be able to interface with the neurons at a detailed level, and you need to be able to fire the right neurons, read the right neurons, and then effectively you can create a circuit, replace what's broken with silicon, and essentially fill in the missing functionality. And then over time, we can develop a tertiary layer. So if like the limbic system is the primary layer, then the cortex is like the second layer. And as I said, obviously the cortex is vastly more intelligent than the limbic system, but people generally like the fact that they have a limbic system and a cortex. I haven't met anyone who wants to delete either one of them. They're like, okay, I'll keep them both. That's cool.
The limbic system's kind of fun.
That's where the fun is. Yep, absolutely. And then people generally don't want to lose the cortex either, right? So they like having the cortex and the limbic system.
Yeah.
And then there's a tertiary layer, which will be digital superintelligence. And I think there's room for optimism, given that the cortex, the cortex is very intelligent and the limbic system is not, and yet they work together well. Perhaps there can be a tertiary layer where digital superintelligence lies, and that will be vastly more intelligent than the cortex, but still coexist peacefully and in a benign manner with the cortex and limbic system.
That's a super exciting future, both on low-level engineering that I saw is being done here and the actual possibility in the next few decades.
It's important that Neuralink solve this problem sooner rather than later, because the point at which we have digital superintelligence, that's when we pass the singularity, and things become just very uncertain. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad or good, but the point at which we pass the singularity, things become extremely unstable. So we want to have a human-brain interface before the singularity, or at least not long after it, to minimize existential risk for humanity and consciousness as we know it.
So, but there's a lot of fascinating actual engineering, low-level problems here at Neuralink that are quite exciting. What
the problems that we face in Neuralink are material science, electrical engineering, software, mechanical engineering, microfabrication. It's a bunch of engineering disciplines, essentially. That's what it comes down to, is that you have to have a tiny electrode. It's so small it doesn't hurt neurons, but it's got to last for as long as a person. So it's got to last for decades. And then you've got to take that signal, and you've got to process that signal locally at low power. So we need a lot of chip design engineers that are, because we've got to do signal processing, and do so in a very power efficient way so that we don't heat your brain up, because the brain's very heat sensitive. And then we've got to take those signals and we've got to do something with them, and then we've got to stimulate the back to so you could bidirectional communication. So if somebody's good at material science, software, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, chip design, microfabrication, those are the things we need to work on. We need to be good at material science so that we can have tiny electrodes that last a long time. And it's a tough thing with the material science problem. It's a tough one because you're trying to read and simulate electrically in an electrically active area. Your brain is very electrically active and electrochemically active. So how do you have, say, a coating on the electrode that doesn't dissolve over time and is safe in the brain? This is a very hard problem. And then how do you collect those signals in a way that is most efficient? Because you really just have very tiny amounts of power to process those signals. And then we need to automate the whole thing so it's like LASIK. So it's not. If this is done by neurosurgeons, there's no way it can scale to a large numbers of people, and it needs to scale to large numbers of people because I think ultimately we want the future to be determined by a large number of humans.
Do you think that this has a chance to revolutionize surgery, period? So neurosurgery and surgery all across?
Yeah, for sure. It's got to be like LASIK. Like if LASIK had to be done by hand by a person, that wouldn't be great. Yeah. So it's done by a robot. And the ophthalmologist kind of just needs to make sure your head's in the right position, and then they can just press a button and go.
On the merger with AI question and the incredible work that's being done at Neuralink, there's a lot of fascinating innovation here across different disciplines going on. So the flexible wires, the robotic sewing machine, the responsive brain movement, everything around ensuring safety and so on. So we currently understand very little about the human brain. Do you also hope that the work at Neuralink will help us understand more about the human mind, about the brain?
Yeah, I think the work in Neuralink will definitely shed a lot of insight into how the brain and the mind works. Right now, just the data we have regarding how the brain works is very limited. We've got fMRI, which is that's kind of like putting a stethoscope on the outside of a factory wall and then putting it like all over the factory wall, and you can sort of hear the sounds, but you don't know what the machines are doing really. It's hard. You can infer a few things, but it's a very broad brushstroke. In order to really know what's going on in the brain, you have to have high precision sensors, and then you want to have stimulus and response. Like if you trigger a neuron, how do you feel? What do you see? How does it change your perception of the world?
You're speaking to physically, just getting close to the brain, being able to measure signals from the brain.
Yeah,
will give us sort of open the door inside the factory.
Yes, exactly. Being able to have high precision sensors that tell you what individual neurons are doing, and then being able to trigger the neuron and see what the response is in the brain, so you can see the consequences of if you fire this neuron, what happens? How do you feel? What does it change? It'll be really profound to have this in people, because people can articulate their change, like if there's a change in mood, or if they can tell you if they can see better or hear better, or be able to form sentences better or worse, or their memories are jogged, or that kind of thing.
So, what do you think about in terms of this coevolution of the work around brain-computer interfaces, and maybe Neuralink and Elon seeing Neuralink in particular as its long-term mission as a symbiosis with artificial intelligence? So, like giving a greater bandwidth channel of communication between technology, AI systems, and the biological neural networks of our human mind. What do you think about this idea of connecting directly to the brain in AI systems?
I mean, okay, I've listened to your podcasts with Elon. I've listened to Elon before. He's very intelligent, obviously, super smart guy. I think this is already, not in the specific ways that he is doing it, but I think we are already doing that. Okay. And I can give you some examples. And there are really trivial examples, but they do make the point. And this is one of them. So before he started this research on UFOs and UAPs and technology, I actually was looking at the effects of technology and in particular media on religion. And what I did was I was lucky to be asked to be a consultant for various movies. And one in particular I learned a lot from, and that was The Conjuring. So I was a history consultant for The Conjuring. It happens to be my field. It's Catholic studies, right? And you've got these people who are real people, and they're, exorcising demons and things like that. Okay, so I thought, wow, this is a great example for me. I didn't do it for the money. It doesn't pay well, but I did it to learn, right?
Yeah.
So I work closely with the screenwriters who I work with now all the time. I work with them all the time now. And what I found was this. I found that as the most interesting part of the creation of this movie was the editing process, because they would use it would go through editing, and they would use test audiences, and a lot of the test audiences would be like, there's like these things where they test their flicker rates and things like that, the eye flicker rates, and so when it goes really intense, they go to UC Irvine and they do this thing called cognitive consumption, which is basically cognitive consumerism, where they basically hook test audiences up to EKGs and they read their brains.
Yeah.
And they figure out which scenes create the most
arousal.
Yeah. And so they cut out all the other scenes. Okay. So what we're getting like this drug when we go to the movies or when we do video games or when we watch, we're literally physiologically responding to our technologies. So we're already there. We're already interfacing with them physiologically. So that's my example. Now, the kind of thing that he's doing, Musk is doing with Neuralink, I say go for it. That's awesome. I hope he does it. I'm fascinated. I want it to happen. Why do I want it to happen? Because I think that, well, first, it's inevitable that it's going to happen. I also want to point out that Jacques Vallée was trying to get this done back in the 60s and the 70s. He was writing papers about, in fact, the ARPANET, the proto-internet, was called Augmentation of the Human Intellect. So we've been doing this for a while, okay? So props to Elon Musk, but we've been thinking about this for a good time. We've even been visioning it, okay? So there was a really interesting Jesuit priest, he was French, Teilhard de Chardin. I don't know if you know who he is. If not, he's fascinating. He was actually a soldier before he became a priest. And so he also saw what he called a biosphere. Now, this guy is talking in like the early 20th century, like the 1917, 19, that time period. And so basically he said and wrote about this thing called the noosphere. And he basically said, there will be a point when we merge with our technology, and it's going to be somewhat like some kind of a biosphere. We have this atmosphere, and then we have this stratosphere, and it's going to be this biosphere, and we're all going to be hooked into it mentally. So we'll be able to communicate in a way in which we don't communicate now. So, that sounds so similar to the singularity.
Well, let me ask you, there's a guy named Elon Musk. There's a company called Neuralink, and there's a general field called brain-computer interfaces.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interface between your two loves, which is the brain and the intelligence. So there's like very direct applications of brain-computer interfaces for people with different conditions, more in the short term.
Yeah.
But there's also these sci-fi futuristic kinds of ideas of AI systems being able to communicate in a high bandwidth way with the brain, bidirectional.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about Neuralink and BCI in general as a possibility?
So I think BCI is a cool research area. And in fact, when I got interested in brains initially, so I was enrolled at Stanford, and when I got interested in brains, it was through a brain computer interface talk that Krishna Shenoy gave. That's when I even started thinking about the problem. So it is definitely a fascinating research area, and the applications are enormous, right? So there is a science fiction scenario of brains directly communicating. Let's keep that aside for the time being. Even just the intermediate milestones they're pursuing, which are very reasonable as far as I can see, being able to control an external limb using direct connections from the brain, and being able to write things into the brain. So those are all good steps to take, and they have enormous applications. People losing limbs being able to control prosthetics, quadriplegics being able to control something. And therapeutics. And I also know about another company working in this space called Paradromics. They're doing, it's based on a different electrode array, but trying to attack some of the same problems. So I think it's a very
also surgery.
Correct, surgically implanted electrodes. Yeah. I think of it as a very, very promising field, especially when it is helping people overcome some limitations. Now, at some point, of course, it will advance to the level of being able to communicate.
How hard is that problem, do you think? Okay, let's say we magically solve what I think is a really hard problem of doing all of this safely.
Yeah.
So like being able to connect electrodes, and not just thousands, but like millions to the brain.
I think it's very, very hard because you also do not know what the what will happen to the brain with that, right? In the sense of how does the brain adapt to something like that?
And it's, as we were learning, the brain is quite, in terms of neuroplasticity, is pretty malleable.
Correct.
So it's going to adjust.
Correct.
So the machine learning side, the computer side is going to adjust, and then the brain's going to adjust.
Exactly. And then what soup does this land us into is
the kind of hallucinations you might get from this. They might be pretty intense.
Yeah. So
just connecting to all of Wikipedia. It's interesting whether we need to be able to figure out the basic protocol of the brain's communication schemes in order to get them to the machine and the brain to talk. Because another possibility is the brain actually just adjusts to whatever the heck the computer is doing.
Exactly. That's the way I find that to be a more promising way. It's basically saying, okay, attach electrodes to some part of the cortex, okay, and make sure, maybe if it is done from birth, the brain will adapt. It says that, that part is not damaged. It was not used for anything. Yeah. These electrodes are attached there, right? And now you train that part of the brain to do this high bandwidth communication between something else, right? Yeah. And if you do it like that, then it is brain adapting to, and of course your external system is designed such that it is adaptable. Just like we, design computers or mouse, keyboard, all of them to be interacting with humans. So of course that feedback system is designed to be human compatible, but now it is not trying to record from all of the brain and now two systems trying to adapt to each other. It's the brain adapting into one way. So.
That's fascinating. The brain is connected to the internet. It's connected. Just imagine just connecting it to Twitter and just taking that stream of information. But again, if we take a step back, I don't know what your intuition is. I feel like that is not as hard of a problem as the doing it safely. There's a huge barrier to surgery,
right?
Because the biological system, it's a mush of weird stuff.
Correct. So that the surgery part of it, biology part of it, the long term repercussions part of it. Again, I don't know what else will. We often find after a long time in biology that that idea was wrong, right? So people used to cut off this. The gland called the thymus or something, and then they found that that actually causes cancer.
And then there's a subtle millions of variables involved. But this whole process, the nice thing, just again with Elon, just like colonizing Mars, seems like a ridiculously difficult idea, but in the process of doing it, we might learn a lot about the biology of the neurobiology of the brain. The neuroscience side of things. It's if you want to learn something, do the most difficult version of it. And see what you learn.
The intermediate steps that they are taking sounded all very reasonable to me.
It's great. Yeah. Well, but everything with Elon is the timeline seems insanely fast. So that's the only open question.
There's no abstractions.
Yeah.
And this is why I know we have some common friends at Neuralink, and I love the demonstration they did recently. I'm a huge fan of what they're doing and where they're headed. And no, I don't get paid to say that. And I have no, business relationship to them. I'm just a huge fan of the people and the mission. But my question was to some of them, when are you going to go subcortical? Because if you want to control an animal, you don't do it in the cortex. The cortex is like the abstract painting I made of your face. Removing one piece or changing something may or may not matter for the abstraction. But when you are in the subcortical areas of the brain, a stimulating electrode can evoke an entire behavior or an entire state. And so the brain, if we're going to have a discussion about the brain and how the brain works, we need to really be clear which brain, because everyone loves neocortex. It's canonical circuits in cortex, we're going to get the cortical connectome, and sure, necessary, but not sufficient. Not to be able to plug in patterns of electrical stimulation and get behavior. Eventually we'll get there. But if you're talking subcortical circuits, that's where the action is. That's where you could potentially cure Parkinson's by stimulating the subthalamic nucleus, because we know that it gates motor activation patterns in very predictable ways. So I think for those that are interested in neuroscience, it pays to pay attention to is this a circuit that abstracts the sensory information, or is it just one that builds up hierarchical models in a very predictable way? And there's a huge chasm in neuroscience right now because there's no conceptual leadership. No one knows which way to go. And this is why I think Neuralink has captured an amazing opportunity, which was, okay, well, while all you academic research labs are figuring all this stuff out, we're going to pick a very specific goal and make the goal the endpoint. And some academic laboratories do that. But I think that's a beautiful way to attack this whole thing about the brain because it's very concrete. Let's restore motion to the Parkinsonian patient. Academic labs do that, want to do that too, of course. Let's restore speech to the stroke patient. But there's nothing abstract about that. That's about figuring out the solution to a particular problem. So anyway, those are my, and I admit I've mixed in a lot of opinion there, but having spent some time, like 25 years digging around in the brain and listening to neurons firing and looking at them anatomically, I think given it's 2020, we need to ask the right, the way to get better answers is ask better questions. And the really high level stuff is fun. It makes for good conversation. And it has brought enormous interest. But I think the questions about consciousness and dreaming and stuff, they're fascinating. But I don't know that we're there yet.
So you're saying there might be a chasm in the two views of the power of the brain arising from the circuitry that forms abstractions, or the power of the brain arising from the majority of the circuitry that's just doing very brute force dumb things that are that don't have any fancy kind of stuff going on. That's really interesting to think about.
And which one to go after first.
Yeah.
And here
From
I'm poaching badly from someone I've never met, but whose work I follow, which is, and it was actually on your podcast, I think Elon Musk said, basically the brain is a monkey brain with a supercomputer on top. And I thought that's actually probably the best description of the brain I've ever heard, because it captures a lot of important features like limbic friction, right? We think of when we're making plans, we're using the prefrontal cortex and we're executive function and all this kind of stuff. But think about the drug addict who's driven to go pursue heroin or cocaine. They make plans. So clearly they use their frontal cortex. It's just that it's been hijacked by the limbic system and all the monkey brain, as you refer to. It's really not fair to monkeys though, Elon, because actually monkeys can make plans. They just don't make plans as sophisticated as us. I've spent a lot of time with monkeys, but I've also spent a lot of time with humans. Anyway,
But you're saying there's a lot of value to focusing on the monkey brain, or whatever the heck you call it.
I do, because let's say I had an ability to place a chip anywhere I wanted in the brain today and activate it or inhibit that area. I'm not sure I would put that chip in neocortex, except maybe to just kind of have some fun and see what happens. The reason is it's an abstraction machine. And especially if I wanted to make a mass production tool in mass production that I could give to a lot of people, because it's quite possible that your abstractions are different enough than mine that I wouldn't know what patterns of firing to induce. But if let's say I want to increase my level of focus and creativity, well, then I would love to be able to, for instance, control my level of limbic friction. I would love to be able to wake up and go, what? I have an 8 o'clock appointment. I wake up slowly. So between 7 and 8, but I want to do a lot of linear thinking. So you know what? I'm going to turn down the limbic friction or ramp up prefrontal cortex's activation. So there's a lot of stuff that can happen in the thalamus with sensory gating. For instance, you could shut down that shell around the thalamus and allow more creative thinking by allowing more lateral connections. Those would be the experiments I'd want to do. So they're in the subcortical, quote unquote, monkey brain, but you could then look at what sorts of abstract thoughts and behaviors would arise from that, rather than, and here I'm not pointing my finger at Neuralink at all, but there's this obsession with neocortex. But I might lose a few friends, but I'll hopefully gain a few. And also, one of the reasons people spend so much time in neocortex, I have a fact and an opinion. One fact is that you can image there and you can record there. Right now, the 2-photon and 1-photon microscopy methods that allow you to image deep into the brain still don't allow you to image down really deep unless you're jamming prisms in there and endoscopes. And then the endoscopes are very narrow. So you're getting very, it's like looking at the bottom of the ocean through a spotlight. And so much easier to look at the waves up on top. Right. So let's face it, folks, a lot of the reasons why there's so many recordings in layer 2, 3 of cortex with all this advanced microscopy is because it's very hard to image deeper. Now, the microscopes are getting better. And thanks to amazing work, mainly of engineers and chemists and physicists, let's face it, they're the ones who brought this revolution to neuroscience in the last 10 years or so. You can image deeper, but we don't really, that's why you see so many reports on layer 2, 3. The other thing, which is purely opinion, and I'm not going after anybody here, but is that as long as there's no clear right answer, it becomes a little easier to do creative work in a structure where no one really knows how it works. So it's fun to probe around because anything you see is novel. If you're going to work in the thalamus or the pulvinar or the hypothalamus or these structures that have been known about since the 60s and 70s and really since the centuries ago, you are dealing with you have to combat existing models. Yeah. And whereas in cortex, no one knows how the thing works. Mm-hmm. The neocortex, 6-layer cortex. And so
everything is valid.
There's a lot more room for discovery. Yeah. There's a lot more room for discovery. And I'm not calling anyone out. I love cortex. We've published some papers on cortex. It's super interesting. But I think with the tools that are available nowadays and where people are trying to head of not just reading from the brain, monitoring activity, but writing to the brain, I think we really have to be careful and we need to be thoughtful about what are we trying to write? What script are we trying to write? Because there are many brain structures for which we already know what scripts they write. And I think there's tremendous value there. I don't think it's boring. The fact that they act like machines makes them predictable. Those are your zeros and ones. Yeah. Let's start there. But what's sort of happening in this field of writing to the brain is there's this idea. And again, I want to be clear. I'm not pointing at Neuralink. I'm mainly pointing at the neocortical jockeys out there that you go and you observe patterns and then you think replaying those patterns is going to give rise to something interesting. Yeah. I should call out one experiment or two experiments which were done by Susumu Tonegawa, Nobel Prize winner from MIT. He's done important work in memory and immunology, of course, is where he got his Nobel, as well as Mark Mayford's lab at UC San Diego. They did an experiment where they monitored a bunch of neurons while an animal learned something. Mm-hmm. Then they captured those neurons through some molecular tricks so they could replay the neurons. Mm-hmm. So now there's like perfect case scenario. It's like, okay, you monitor the neurons in your brain. Then I say, okay, neurons 1 through 100 were played in the particular sequence. So you know the space-time, you know the keys on the piano that were played that gave rise to the song, which was the behavior. And then you go back and you reactivate those neurons, except you reactivate them all at once, like slamming on all the keys once on the piano, and you get the exact same behavior. So the space-time code may be meaningless for some structures. Now that's freaky. That's a scary thing because what that means is that all the space-time firing in cortex, the space part may matter more than the time part. So, rate codes and space-time codes, we don't know. And, I'd rather deliver more answers in this discussion than questions, but I think it's an important consideration.
You're saying some of the magic is in the early stages of what the closer to the raw information.
I believe so. I believe so. You know the stimulus, the neuron that encodes that stimulus, so you know the transformation. When I say this, for those of you that don't think about sensory transformations, it's like I can show you a red circle, and then I look at how many times the neuron fires in response to that red circle. And then I show the red circle a bunch of times, green circle, see if it changes. And then essentially the number of times, that is the transformation. You've converted red circle into like 3 action potentials, beep, 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 or whatever you want to call it, for those that think in sound space. So that's what you've created. You know the transformation, and you march up it's called the neuraxis as you go from the periphery up into the cortex. And we know that, and I know Lisa, Feldman Barrett, or is it Barrett Feldman?
Barrett
Feldman, excuse me, Lisa, that talked a lot about this, that, birds can do sophisticated things and whatnot as well. But humans, there's a strong, what we call cephalization. A lot of the processing is moved up into the cortex and out of these subcortical areas, but it happens nonetheless. And so as long as you know the transformations, you are in a perfect place to build machines or add machines to the brain that exactly mimic what the brain wants to do, which is take events in the environment and turn them into internal firing of neurons.
So the mastery of the brain can happen at the early level. Another perspective of it is you saying this means that humans aren't that special. if we look at the evolutionary time scale, the leap to intelligence is not that special. So like the extra layers of abstraction isn't where most of the magic happens of intelligence, which gives me hope that maybe if that's true, that means the evolution of intelligence is not that rare of an event.
I certainly hope not.
So you hope there's...
I hope there are other forms of intelligence. I mean, I think what humans are really good at, and here I want to be clear that this is not a formal model, but what humans are really good at is taking that plasma barbell that we were talking about earlier, and not just using it for analysis of space, like your immediate environment, but also using historical information. Like I can read a book today about the history of medicine. I happen to be doing that lately for some stuff I'm researching. And I can take that information, and if I want, I can inject it into my plans for the future. Mm-hmm. Other animals don't seem to do that over the same timescales that we do. Mm-hmm. Now, it may be that the chipmunks are all hiding little like notebooks everywhere in the form of like little dirt castles or something that we don't understand. I mean, the waggle dance of the bee is the most famous example. Mm-hmm. Bees come back to the hive, they orient relative to the honeycomb, and they waggle. There's a guy down in Australia named Srinivasan who studied this. And it's really interesting. No one really understands it, except he understands it best. The bee waggles in a couple ways relative to the orientation of the honeycomb, and then all the other bees see that, it's visual, and they go out and they know the exact coordinate system to get to the source of whatever it was, the food, and bring it back. Mm-hmm. And he's done it where they isolate the bees, he's changed the visual flight environment, all this stuff. They are communicating. Yeah. And they're communicating something about something they saw recently, but it doesn't extend over very long periods of time. The same way that you and I can both read a book, or you can recommend something to me, and then we could converge on a set of ideas later. And in fairness, because she was the one that said it and I didn't, and I hadn't even thought of it. When you talked to Lisa on your podcast, she brought up something beautiful, which is that had never really occurred to me, and I was sort of embarrassed that it hadn't, but it's really beautiful and brilliant, which is that, you know, we don't just encode senses in the form of like color and light and sound waves and taste, but ideas become a form of sensory mapping. And that's where the cool, you know, the really, really cool and exciting stuff is, but we just don't understand what the receptive fields are for ideas. What's an idea receptive field?
And how they're communicated between humans, because we seem to be able to encode those ideas in some kind of way. It's taking all the raw information and the internal physical states, that sensory information, put into this concept blob that we cut in the store, and then we're able to communicate that.
Yeah, your abstractions are different than mine. Yeah, I actually think the comment section, you know, on social media is a beautiful example of where the abstractions are different for different people.
Yeah,
so much of the misunderstanding of the world is because of these idea receptive fields. They're not the same. Mm-hmm. Whereas I can look at a photoreceptor neuron or olfactory neuron or a V1 neuron, and I am certain, I would bet my life that yours look and respond exactly the same way that Lisa's do and mine do. Yeah. But once you get beyond there, it gets tricky. And so when you say something or I say something and somebody gets upset about it or even happy about it, their concept of that might be quite a bit different. They don't really know what you mean. They only know what it means to them.
Yeah, so from a Neuralink perspective, it makes sense to optimize the control and the augmentation of the more primitive circuitry. So like the stuff that is closer to the raw sensory information.
Go deeper. I think by the way, go deeper into the brain. And to be fair, so Matt McDougall, who's the neurosurgeon at Neuralink and also awesome. Clinical neurosurgeon, great guy, brilliant. They have amazing people. Yeah. I have to give it to them. They have been very cryptic in recent years. Their website was just like nothing there. They really know how to do things with style, and they've upset a lot of people, but that's good too. But Matt is there. I know Matt. He actually came up through my lab at Stanford, although he was a neurosurgery resident. But he spent time in our lab. He actually came out on the shark dive and did great white shark diving with my lab to collect the VR that we use in our fear stuff. I've talked to Matt, and I think he and other folks there are hungry for the deeper brain structures. Yeah. The problem is that damn vasculature, all that blood supply. It's not trivial to get through and down into the brain without damaging the vasculature in the neocortex, which is on the outer crust. But once you start getting into the thalamus and closer to some of the main arterial sources, you really risk getting massive bleeds. And so it's an issue that can be worked out. It just is hard.
This is maybe be nice to educate. I'm showing my ignorance. So the smart stuff is on the surface. So I didn't realize this. I didn't quite realize, because you keep saying deep.
Yeah. So
like the early stages are deep.
Yeah. So
in actual physically in the brain.
Yeah. So the way that of course you got your deep brain structures. They're involved in breathing and heart rate and kind of lizard brain stuff. And then on top of that, this is the model of the brain that no one really subscribes to anymore, but anatomically it works. And then on top in mammals. And then on top of that, you have the limbic structures, which gate sensory information and decide whether or not you're going to listen to something more than you're going to look at it, or you're going to split your attention to both, kind of sensory allocation stuff. And then the neocortex is on the outside. And that is where you get a lot of this abstraction stuff. And now not all cortical areas are doing abstraction. Some like visual area 1, auditory area 1, they're just doing concrete representations. But as you get into the higher order stuff, when you start hearing names like inferoparietal cortex, and when you start hearing multiple names in the same, then you're talking about higher order areas. But actually, there's an important experiment that drives a lot of what people want to do with brain-machine interface, and that's the work of Bill Newsom, who is at Stanford, and Tony Movshin, who runs the Center for Neuroscience at NYU. This is a wild experiment, and I think it might freak a few people out if they really think about it too deeply. But anyway, here it goes. There's an area called MT in the cortex. And if I showed you a bunch of dots all moving up, and this is what Tony and Bill and some of the other people in that lab did way back when, is they show a bunch of dots moving up. Somewhere in MT, there's some neurons that respond. They fire when the neurons move up. And then what they did is they started varying the coherence of that motion. So they made it so only 50% of the dots moved up and the rest moved randomly. Mm-hmm. And that neuron fires a little less. And eventually it's random and that neuron stops firing because it's just kind of dots moving everywhere. It's awesome. And there's a systematic map so that other neurons are responding to things moving down and other things are responding left and other things are moving right. Okay. So there's a map of direction space. You go, okay, well, that's great. You could lesion MT. Animals lose the ability to do these kind of coherence discrimination or direction discrimination. But the amazing experiment, the one that just is kind of eerie, is that they lowered a stimulating electrode into MT, found a neuron that responds to when dots go up. But then they silenced that neuron. And sure enough, the animal doesn't recognize the neurons that are going up. And then they move the dots down. They stimulate the neuron that responds to things moving up. And the animal responds, because it can't speak, it responds by doing a lever press, which says the dots are moving up. So in other words, the dots are moving down in reality on the computer screen. They're stimulating the neuron that responds to dots moving up. And the perception of the animal is that dots are moving up, which tells you that your perception of external reality absolutely has to be a neuronal abstraction. It is not tacked to the movement of the dots in any absolute way. Your perception of the outside world depends entirely on the activation patterns of neurons in the brain. And you could hear that and say, well, duh, because if I stimulate, the stretch reflex and you kick or something or whatever, the knee reflex and you kick, of course, there's a neuron that triggers that, but it didn't have to be that way. Yeah. Because A, the animal had prior experience. B, you're way up in this, higher order cortical areas. What this means is that, and I generally try and avoid conversations about this kind of thing, but what this means is that we are constructing our reality with this space-time firing, the zeros and ones, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with the actual reality. And the animal or person can be absolutely convinced that that's what's happening.
Are you familiar with the work of Donald Hoffman? So he makes an evolutionary argument that's not important of that our brains are completely detached from reality, in the sense that he makes a radical case that we have no idea what physical reality is. And in fact, it's drastically different than what we think it is.
Oh my.
So he goes,
That's scary.
So he doesn't say like there's just, because you're kind of implying there's a gap. There might be a gap with constructing an illusion, and then maybe using communication to maybe create a consistency that's sufficient for human collaboration or whatever, or mammal, just maybe even just life forms are constructing a consistent reality that's maybe detached. I mean, that's really cool that neurons are constructing that, like that you can prove that. This is what neuroscience at its best, vision science. But he says that like our brain is actually just lost its shit on the path of evolution to where we're just playing games with each other in constructing realities that allow our survival, but it's completely detached from physical reality.
Like we're missing a lot.
We're missing like most of it, if not all of it.
Well, this was it's fascinating because I just saw the Oliver Sacks documentary. There's a new documentary out about his life. And there's this one part where he's like, I've spent part of my life trying to imagine what it would like to be a bat or something, to see the world through the life, the sensory apparatus of a bat. And he did this with these patients that were locked into these horrible syndromes, that to pull out some of the beauty of their experience as well, not just communicate the suffering, although the suffering too. And as I was listening to him talk about this, I started to realize, it's like, well, what, like there are these mantis shrimps that can see 60 shades of pink or something. And they see this stuff all the time, and animals that can see UV light. Every time I learn about an animal that can sense other things in the environment that I can't, like heat sensing, I don't crave that experience the same way Sacks talked about craving that experience. But it does throw another penny in the jar for what you're saying, which is that it could be that most, if not all, of what I perceive and believe is just a neural fabrication, and that for better or for worse, we all agree on enough of the same neural fabrications in the same time and place that we're able to function.
Not only that, but we agree with the things that are trying to eat us enough to where they don't eat us, meaning like that it's not just us humans, right?
Oh, I see. Because it's interactive.
It's interactive. Now I think it's a really nice thought experiment. I think because Donald really frames it in a scientific, like he makes a hard, like as hard as our discussion has been now, he makes a hard scientific case that we don't know shit about reality. I think that's a little bit hardcore, but I think it's it is
hardcore. It is hardcore.
I think it's a good thought experiment that kind of cleanses the palate of the confidence we might have about because we are operating in this abstraction space, and the sensory space might be something very different. And it's kind of interesting to think about if you start to go into the realm of Neuralink, or start to talk about just everything that you've been talking about with dream states and psychedelics and stuff like that. Which layer can we control and play around with to maybe look into a different slice of reality? You
just got to do the experiment. The key is to just do the experiment in the most ethical way possible. That's the beauty of experiments. This is why, there's wonderful theoretical neuroscience happening now to make predictions, but that's why experimental science is so wonderful. You can go into the laboratory and poke around in there and be a brain explorer and listen to and write to neurons. And when you do that, you get answers. You don't always get the answers you want, but that's the beauty of it. I think when you were saying this thing about reality and the Donald Hoffman model, I was thinking about children. Like when I have an older sister, she's very sane. But when she was a kid, she had an imaginary friend.
Yeah.
And she would play with this imaginary friend. And there was a consistency. This friend was like, it was Larry, lived in a purple house. Larry was a girl. It was like all this stuff that a young child wouldn't have any issue with. And then one day she announced that Larry had died, right? And it wasn't dramatic or traumatic.
Yeah.
And that was it. And she just stopped. And I always wonder what that neurodevelopmental event was that kept her out of a psychiatric ward had she got, kept that imaginary friend.
Yeah.
But it's also, there was something kind of sad to it. I think the way it was told to me, because I'm the younger brother, I wasn't around for that. But my dad told me that, there was a kind of a sadness because it was this beautiful reality that had been constructed. And so we kind of I wonder, as you're telling me this, whether or not, as adults, we try and create as much reality for children as we can so that they can make predictions and feel safe, because the ability to make predictions is a lot of what keeps our autonomic arousal in check. I mean, we go to sleep every night and we give up total control, and that should frighten us deeply. But unfortunately, autonomic arousal yanks us down under, and we don't negotiate too much. So you sleep sooner or later. I don't know. I was a little worried we'd get into discussions about the nature of reality, because it's interesting in the laboratory. I'm very much like, what's the experiment? What would what's the analysis going to look like? What mutant mouse are we going to use? What experience are we going to put someone through? But I think it's wonderful that in 2020 we can finally have discussions about this stuff and kind of peek around the corner and say, well, Neuralink and others who are doing similar things are going to figure it out. They're going to, the answers will show up, and we just have to be open to interpretation.
So what do you think about the expansion, not through the biology side, but through the BCI, the brain-computer interfaces? Yeah, you got a chance to check out the Neuralink stuff.
It's super interesting. Like humans, like our thoughts to manifest as action. Like as a kid, like shooting a rifle was super fun. Driving a mini bike, doing things. Mm-hmm. And then computer games, I think, for a lot of kids became the thing where they can do what they want. They can fly a plane, they can do this, right? But you have to have this physical interaction. Now imagine, you could just imagine stuff and it happens, right? Like really richly and interestingly. Like we kind of do that when we dream. Like dreams are funny because like if you have some control or awareness in your dreams, like it's very realistic looking or not realistic, depends on the dream, but you can also manipulate that. And what's possible there is odd, and the fact that nobody understands it's hilarious. But
do you think it's possible to expand that capability through computing?
Sure.
Is there some interesting, so from a hardware designer perspective, do you think it'll present totally new challenges in the kind of hardware required? So this hardware isn't standalone computing.
Well, it's
networking with the brain.
So today, computer games are rendered by GPUs.
Right.
Right. So, but you've seen the GAN stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Where trained neural networks render realistic images, but there's no pixels, no triangles, no shaders, no light maps, no nothing. Mm-hmm. So the future of graphics is probably AI. Right.
Yes.
Now that AI is heavily trained by lots of real data. Right. So if you have an interface with a AI renderer, right? So if you say render a cat, it won't say, well, how tall's the cat and how big it'll render a cat. And you might say, mm-hmm. well, a little bigger, a little smaller, mm-hmm. make it a tabby, shorter hair, like you could tweak it. Like the amount of data you'll have to send to interact with a very powerful AI renderer could be low.
But the question is, brain-computer interfaces would need to render not onto a screen, but render onto the brain, and like directly, so that there's a bandwidth.
Well, it could do it both ways. I mean, our eyes are really good sensors. It could render onto a screen, and we could feel like we're participating in it. They're gonna have, like the Oculus kind of stuff. It's going to be so good when it projects into your eyes, you think it's real. They're slowly solving those problems. And I suspect when the renderer of that information into your head is also AI mediated, they'll be able to give you the cues that, you really want for depth and all kinds of stuff. Like your brain is partly faking your visual field, right? Like your eyes are twitching around, but you don't notice that. Occasionally they blank, you don't notice that. There's all kinds of things like you think you see over here, but you don't really see there.
Yeah.
It's all fabricated.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, peripheral vision is fascinating.
So if you have an AI renderer that's trained to understand exactly how you see and the kind of things that enhance the realism of that experience, could be super real, actually. So I don't know what the limits to that are. But obviously, if we have a brain interface that goes inside your visual cortex in a better way than your eyes do, which is possible, it's a lot of neurons.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be even cooler.
Well, the really cool thing is it has to do with the infinite fun that you're referring to, which is our brains seem to be very limited, and like you said, computations
Also very plastic.
Very plastic, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a interesting combination.
But the interesting open question is the limits of that neuroplasticity. Like how flexible is that thing? Because we haven't really tested it.
We know about that experiments where they put like a pressure pad on somebody's head and had a visual transducer pressurize it, and somebody slowly learned to see.
Yep.
It's
especially at a young age, if you throw a lot at it, like what can it completely? So can you like arbitrarily expand it with computing power? So connected to the internet directly somehow?
Yeah, the answer is probably yes.
So the problem with biology and ethics is like there's a mess there. Like us humans are perhaps unwilling to take risks into directions that are full of uncertainty. So it's
90% of the population is unwilling to take risks. The other 10% is rushing into the risks unaided by any infrastructure whatsoever. And and that's where all the fun happens in society. There's been huge transformations in the last couple thousand years.
There's other tools that are kind of interesting. We've been talking about this at the psychological level, but there's also a neuroscience perspective of it. If we kind of like go past the skull into the brain with the neurons firing, there's ideas of brain-computer interfaces. First of all, there's a whole field of neuroscience that's kind of zooming in and studying the firing of the brain, the firing of the neurons in the brain, of how from those neurons emerges all the things that we think that make us human. That's a fascinating exploration of the human mind. That's of course where the psychedelics have the biochemical effects on those neurons. There's ideas of brain-computer interfaces, which, if you look at especially what Neuralink is doing with this long-term vision, with Elon Musk and Neuralink, they hope to expand. He calls it a wizard hat. They hope. This is back to the humor on the internet thing. The wizard hat that expands the capabilities, the capacity of the human mind. Do you think there's something there, or is the human mind so infinitely complex that we're quite a long way away from expanding the capabilities of the human mind through technology versus something like psychedelics?
I wonder how Terence McKenna would answer that question. He looked to shamans as kind of the scientists, the high magicians of the high archaic past and the far-flung future. I'm not going to discount, you know more about AI than I do, so I'm not going to discount it. But I do think that AI paired with the sacred recovery, right? The archaeology of consciousness, and these states, these archaic techniques of ecstasy that were practiced across time. I think that's a winning combination. Part of what I do in the book is just I try and lay out the set and setting. That's often talked about with psychedelics. I mean, so maybe psychedelics in the right AI environment is going to work. I think it'd probably work a lot better with that myth and ritual incorporated. So the reason Eleusis worked for 2,000 years, and let's assume the psychedelic hypothesis has some merit to it. But I think the reason it worked is because you were born into a mythology. You were born into a story about Demeter and Persephone, and you waited your entire life to meet them in the flesh. So you weren't just preparing for a few months. It was a lifetime of expectation, anticipation, ritual preparation. In fact, some of the early church fathers made fun of the Greeks for essentially just piquing people's curiosity and revving up the anticipation, which has something to do with the outcome, by the way. But in other words, I think we need to create a new mythology around this. I don't think you pop into a laboratory. I don't think you pop into a retreat center from one day to the next. I think that in my own case, I feel like I've been preparing 12 years for psychedelics, and I'm still preparing, including in today's conversation. I'm learning new things, and I'm willing to explore it, together with the computer interface. But I do think ritual is a gigantic part of this, and even McKenna would say that. I'll paraphrase him by saying that if you'd met someone who didn't know where they were between the years 1995 and 2005, you would describe them as a fairly damaged person. And yet, who among us knows what was happening in Western civilization between 900 and 1300, let alone 2,500 years ago? So this is, in many ways, the prophet of the psychedelic renaissance, saying that history has lessons. And I don't think they're superficial lessons. I think it cuts to the very core of how and why Western civilization came to be born.
Yeah, but that history can be loaded into AI systems, and I do love the idea of whether it's through brain-computer interfaces or without intrusive, without direct reading of the neurons, and more sort of interactive experience with the robot, that you can have an AI system that steers your psychedelic experience, that helps you when you take a heroic dose of psilocybin, for example, help steer your mind, say just the right things. I mean, you could say that kind of thing with, it's a totally open problem, I would say. You talk about set and setting. This is the interesting thing about Johns Hopkins is, you create a comfortable environment, a safe environment for allowing, then if you take a large dose of psilocybin, that you could trust that everything will be safe and you can really allow the exploration of your mind. But then you don't know from a psychotherapy perspective of during that trip, what a human should say to steer that trip. That's a totally open set of problems. And in some sense, probably throughout history, those rituals, you figured out what are the right things to say to each other.
Exactly.
How to collaborate. And maybe if you can turn that into an optimization problem, AI could figure that out much, much quicker.
I'm with you. So Eleusis was known for three things: the legomena, the dromena, the deichnoumena, the things said, the things done, the things shown. If you can pack that all into your AI interface, I'm in, Lex Fridman.
I'm going to write a proposal and then try to get it through the IRB at MIT for this. I mean, there's a certain sense in which I definitely want to explore psychedelics. I mean, in my personal life, but also more rigorously as a scientist, and to push that forward, and especially in the AI space. And it is difficult how to do that dance when there's gray areas of legality and all those kinds of things, and we're dancing around them, and some of that is language, and some of that is what we socially conceive of as drugs or not. And you're right that perhaps we can reframe it as religious experiences, all those kinds of things. I mean, it's fascinating because it feels like there's a bunch of tools before us that were used by the ancients that we're not utilizing for exploring the human mind, that we very well could be in a rigorous scientific way, in a safe way. And so let's step into the gray area between metaphor and engineering with, I'm not sure if you're familiar with brain-computer interfaces. So a company like Elon Musk has Neuralink that's working on putting electrodes into the brain and trying to be able to both read and send electrical signals. Just as you said, even the basic mechanism of communication in the brain is not something we understand. But do you hope, without understanding the fundamental principles of how the brain works, we'll be able to do something interesting at that gray area of metaphor?
It's not my area. So I hope, in the sense like anybody else hopes for some interesting things to happen from research. I would expect more something like Alzheimer's will get figured out from modern neuroscience. That, there's a lot of human suffering based on brain disease. And we throw things like lithium at the brain. It kind of works. No one has a clue why. That's not quite true, but, mostly we don't know. And that's even just about the biochemistry of the brain and how it leads to mood swings and so on. How thought emerges from that, we were really, really completely dim. So that you might want to hook up electrodes and try to do some signal processing on that and try to find patterns. Fine. By all means, go for it. It's just not scientific at this point. It's like kind of sitting in a satellite and watching the emissions from a city and trying to infer things about the microeconomy, even though you don't have microeconomic concepts. I mean, it's really that kind of thing. And so, yes, can you find some signals that do something interesting or useful? Can you control a cursor or mouse with your brain? Yeah, absolutely. And I can imagine business models based on that, and even, medical applications of that. But from there to understanding algorithms that allow us to really tie in deeply from the brain to the computer, I don't agree with Elon Musk. I don't think that's not for our generation. It's not even for this century.
So just in the hopes of getting you to dream, you've mentioned Kolmogorov and Turing might pop up. Do you think that there might be breakthroughs that will get you to sit back in 5-10 years and say, wow?
Oh, I'm sure there will be, but I don't think that there'll be demos that impress me. I don't think that having a computer call a restaurant and pretend to be a human is breakthrough.
Right.
And people, some people present it as such. It's imitating human intelligence. It's even putting coughs in the thing to make a bit of a PR stunt. And so, fine, that the world runs on those things too. And I don't want to diminish all the hard work and engineering that goes behind things like that, and the ultimate value to the human race. But that's not scientific understanding. And I know the people that work on these things, they are after scientific understanding. In the meantime, they've got to kind of, the train's got to run, and they got mouths to feed, and they got things to do. And there's nothing wrong with all that. I would call that, though, just engineering. And I want to distinguish that between an engineering field like electrical engineering, chemical engineering that originally emerged, that had real principles, and you really knew what you were doing, and you had a little scientific understanding, maybe not even complete. So it became more predictable, and it really gave value to human life because it was understood. And so we don't want to muddle too much these waters of, what we're able to do versus what we really can do in a way that's going to impress the next. So I don't need to be wowed, but I think that someone comes along in 20 years, a younger person who's absorbed all the technology, and for them to be wowed, I think they have to be more deeply impressed. A young Kolmogorov would not be wowed by some of the stunts that you see right now coming from the big companies.
The demos, but do you think the breakthroughs from Kolmogorov would be, and give this question a chance, do you think they'll be in the scientific fundamental principles arena, or do you think it's possible to have fundamental breakthroughs in engineering? Meaning, I would say some of the things that Elon Musk is working with, SpaceX, and then others, sort of trying to revolutionize the fundamentals of engineering, of manufacturing, of saying, here's a problem we know how to do a demo of, and actually taking it to scale.
Yeah, so there's going to be all kinds of breakthroughs. I just don't like that terminology. I'm a scientist, and I work on things day in and day out, and things move along, and eventually say, wow, something happened, but I don't like that language very much. Also, I don't like to prize theoretical breakthroughs over practical ones. I tend to be more of a theoretician, and I think there's lots to do in that arena right now. And so I wouldn't point to the Kolmogorovs. I might point to the Edisons of the era, and maybe Musk is a bit more like that. But, Musk, God bless him, also will say things about AI that he knows very little about. And he doesn't know what he is, leads people astray when he talks about things he doesn't know anything about. Trying to program a computer to understand natural language, to be involved in a dialogue like we're having right now, that ain't gonna happen in our lifetime. You could fake it. You can mimic, sort of take old sentences that humans use and retread them. But the deep understanding of language, no, it's not going to happen. And so from that, I hope you can perceive that the yet deeper kind of aspects in intelligence are not going to happen. Now, will there be breakthroughs? I think that Google was a breakthrough. I think Amazon is a breakthrough. Right. I think Uber is a breakthrough. That bring value to human beings at scale in brand new ways based on data flows and so on. A lot of these things are slightly broken because there's not a kind of a engineering field that takes economic value in context of data and at planetary scale and worries about all the externalities, the privacy. we don't have that field, so we don't think these things through very well. But I see that as emerging, and that will be looking back from 100 years, that will be constitute a breakthrough in this era, just like electrical engineering was a breakthrough in the early part of the last century, and chemical engineering was a breakthrough.
So the scale, the markets that you talk about, and we'll get to, will be seen as sort of breakthrough, and we're in the very early days of really doing interesting stuff there, and we'll get to that. But it's just taking a quick step back. Can you give? We kind of threw off the historian hat. I mean, you briefly said that the history of AI kind of mimics the history of chemical engineering, but so to mess with this zeroth order, maybe first order, what do you think about ideas of brain-computer interfaces? So again, returning to our friend Elon Musk and Neuralink, a company that's trying to, of course, there's a lot of trying to cure diseases and so on with the near term, but the long-term vision is to add an extra layer so basically expand the capacity of the brain, connected to the computational world. Do you think, one, that's possible? Two, how does that change the fundamentals of the zeroth order and the first order?
It's technically possible, but I don't see that the FDA would ever allow me to drill holes in my skull to interface my neocortex the way Elon Musk envisions. So at the moment, I can do horrible things to mice, but I'm not able to do useful things to people, except maybe at some point down the line in medical applications. So this thing that we are envisioning, which means recreational and creational brain-computer interfaces are probably not going to happen in the present legal system.
I love it how I'm asking you out there philosophical and sort of engineering questions, and for the first time ever, you jumped to the legal FDA.
There would be enough people that would be crazy enough to have holes drilled in their skull to try a new type of brain-computer interface.
But
right?
Also, if it works, FDA will approve it. I mean, it's like, because, I work a lot with autonomous vehicles. Yes, you can say that it's going to be a very difficult regulatory process of approving autonomous, but it doesn't mean autonomous vehicles are never going to happen. So
no, they will totally happen as soon as we create jobs for at least 2 lawyers and 1 regulator per car.
So yes, lawyers, that's actually lawyers is the fundamental substrate of reality.
In the US, it's a very weird system. It's not universal in the world. The law is a very interesting software once you realize it, right? These circuits are, in some sense, streams of software, and it largely works by exception handling. So you make decisions on the ground, and they get synchronized with the next level structure as soon as an exception is being thrown.
Yep. So it
escalates the exception handling. The process is very expensive, especially since it incentivizes the lawyers for producing work for lawyers.
Yeah, so the exceptions are actually incentivized for firing often. But to return, outside of lawyers, is there anything fundamentally, is there anything interesting, insightful about the possibility of this extra layer of intelligence added to the brain?
I do think so, but I don't think that you need technically invasive procedures to do so. We can already interface with other people by observing them very, very closely and getting in some kind of empathetic resonance. And I'm a nerd, so I'm not very good at this, but I noticed that people are able to do this to some degree. And it basically means that we model an interface layer of the other person in real time. Mm-hmm. And it works despite our neurons being slow, because most of the things that we do are built on periodic processes. So you just need to entrain yourself with the oscillation that happens. And if the oscillation itself changes slowly enough, you can basically follow along.
Right. But the bandwidth of that interaction, it seems like you can do a lot more computation when there's...
Yeah, of course. But the other thing is that the bandwidth that our brain, our own mind is running on is actually quite slow. So the number of thoughts that I can productively think in any given day is quite limited.
But it's much...
If they had the discipline to write it down and the speed to write it down, maybe it would be a book every day or so. But if you think about the computers that we can build, the magnitudes at which they operate, this would be nothing. It's something that it can put out in a second.
Well, I don't know. So it's possible... sort of the number of thoughts you have in your brain it could be several orders of magnitude higher than what you're possibly able to express through your fingers or through your voice.
Yes. So most of them are going to be repetitive because they...
how do you know that?
Because they have to control the same problems every day. When I walk, there are going to be processes in my brain that model my walking pattern and regulate them and so on, but it's going to be pretty much the same every day.
But that could be because you quickly mentioned this in terms of us using our vocal cords to speak on a podcast. So Elon Musk and Neuralink are working on trying to plug, as per a discussion with computers and biological systems, to connect the two. He's trying to connect our brain to a computer to create a brain-computer interface where they can communicate back and forth. On this line of thinking, do you think this is possible to bridge the gap between our engineered computing systems and the messy biological systems?
My answer would be absolutely. We there's no doubt that we can understand more and more about what goes on in the brain, and we can sort of train the brain. I don't know if you remember the Palm Pilot.
Yeah, Palm Pilot, yeah.
Remember this whole sort of alphabet that they had created? Am I thinking of the same thing? It's basically you had a little pen, and for every character, you had a little scribble that was unique, that the machine could understand, and that instead of trying to teach the machine to recognize human characters, you had basically, they figured out that it's better and easier to train humans to create human-like characters that the machine is better at recognizing. So in the same way, I think what will happen is that humans will be trained to be able to create the mind pattern that the machine will respond to before the machine truly comprehends our thoughts. So the first human-brain interfaces will be tricking humans to speak the machine language, where with the right set of electrodes, I can sort of trick my brain into doing this. And this is the same way that many people learn to control artificial limbs. You basically try a bunch of stuff, and eventually you figure out how your limbs work. That might not be very different from how humans learn to use their natural limbs when they first grow up. Basically, you have these, neoteny period of, this puddle of soup inside your brain, trying to figure out how to even make neuronal connections before you're born. And then learning sounds in utero of, all kinds of echoes and, eventually getting out in the real world. And I don't know if you've seen newborns, but they just stare around a lot. One way to think about this as a machine learning person is, they're just training their edge detectors. Yeah. And eventually they figure out how to train their edge detectors. They work through the second layer of the visual cortex and the third layer and so on and so forth. And you basically have this learning how to control your limbs that probably comes at the same time. You're sort of, throwing random things there, and you realize that, wow, when I do this thing, my limb moves. Let's do the following experiment. Take a breath. What muscles did you flex? Now take another breath and think, what muscles do I flex? The first thing that you're thinking when you're taking a breath is the impact that it has on your lungs. You're like, I'm now going to increase my lungs, or I'm not going to bring air in. But what you're actually doing is just changing your diaphragm. Yeah. That's not conscious, of course. Right. You never think of the diaphragm as a thing. Yeah. And why is that? That's probably the same reason why I think of moving my finger when I actually move my finger. I think of the effect instead of actually thinking of whatever muscle is twitching that actually causes my finger to move. So we basically, in our first years of life, build up this massive lookup table between whatever neuronal firing we do and whatever action happens in our body that we control. If you have a kid grow up with a third limb, I'm sure they'll figure out how to control them probably at the same rate as their natural limbs.
And a lot of the work would be done by so if a third limb is a computer, you kind of have not a faith, but a thought that the brain might be able to figure out, the plasticity would come from the brain. Yeah. The brain would be cleverer than the machine at first.
When I talk about a third limb, that's exactly what I'm saying. An artificial limb that basically just controls your mouse while you're typing. Perfectly natural thing. I mean, again, in a few hundred years.
Maybe sooner than that.
But basically, as long as the machine is consistent in the way that it will respond to your brain impulses, you'll figure out how to control that, and you could play tennis with your third limb. And let me go back to consistency. People who have dramatic accidents that basically take out a whole chunk of their brain can be taught to co-opt other parts of the brain to then control that part. You can basically build up that tissue again and eventually train your body how to walk again and how to read again and how to play again and how to think again, how to speak a language again, etc. So there's a massive amount of malleability that happens, naturally in our way of controlling our body, our brain, our thoughts, our vocal cords, our limbs, etc. And human-machine interfaces are all inevitable if we sort of figure out how to read these electric impulses. But the resolution at which we can understand human thought right now is nil, is ridiculous. So how are human thoughts encoded? It's basically combinations of neurons that co-fire. And these create these things called engrams that eventually form memories and so on and so forth. We know nothing of all that stuff. So before we can actually read into your brain that you want to build a program that does this and this and this and that, we need a lot of neuroscience.
Well, so to push back on that, do you think it's possible that without understanding the functionally about the brain or from the neuroscience or the cognitive science or psychology, whichever level of the brain we'll look at, do you think if we just connect them, just like per your previous point, if we just have a high enough resolution connection between Wikipedia and your brain, the brain will just figure it out with us understanding? Because that's one of the innovations of Neuralink is they're increasing the number of connections to the brain to like several thousand, which before was, in the dozens or whatever.
You're still off by a few orders of magnitude, on the order of 7.
Right. But the thing is, the hope is if you increase that number more and more and more, maybe you don't need to understand anything about the actual, how human thought is represented in the brain. You can just let it figure it out by itself.
Keanu Reeves waking up and saying, "I know kung fu."
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So, yeah, sure.
You don't have faith in the plasticity of the brain to that degree.
It's not about brain plasticity. It's about the input aspect. Basically, I think on the output aspect, being able to control a machine is something that you can probably train your neural impulses that you're sending out to sort of match whatever response you see in the environment. If this thing moved every single time I thought a particular thought, then I could figure out, I could hack my way into moving this thing with just a series of thoughts. I could think guitar, piano, tennis ball, and then this thing would be moving. And then, I would just have the series of thoughts that would sort of result in the impulses that will move this thing the way that I want it. And then eventually it'll become natural because I won't even think about it. In the same way that we control our limbs in a very natural way. But babies don't do that. Babies have to figure it out. And, some of that is hard-coded, but some of that is actually learned based on the whatever soup of neurons you ended up with, whatever connections you pruned them to, and eventually you were born with. A lot of that is coded in the genome, but a huge chunk of that is stochastic in sort of the way that you sort of create all these neurons. They migrate, they form connections, they sort of, spread out, they have particular branching patterns, but then the connectivity itself, unique in every single new person. All this to say that on the output side, absolutely, I'm very, very, hopeful that we can have machines that read thousands of these neuronal connections on the output side, but on the input side, oh boy. I don't expect any time in the near future we'll be able to sort of send a series of impulses that will tell me, oh, Earth to Sun distance, 7.5 million, etc. Like nowhere. I think language will still be the input way rather than sort of any kind of more complex.
With this. So I just spent a day at a company called Neuralink. And what they do is try to design what's called the brain-computer interface. So they try to do thousands readings in the brain, be able to read what the neurons are firing, and then stimulate back, so two-way. Do you think their dream is to expand the capacity of the brain to attain information, sort of increase the bandwidth at which we can search Google kind of thing? Do you think our cognitive capacity might be expanded, our linguistic capacity, our ability to reason might be expanded by adding a machine into the picture?
Can be expanded in a certain sense, but a sense that was known thousands of years ago. a book expands your cognitive capacity. Okay, so could expand it too.
But it's not a fundamental expansion. It's not totally new things could be understood.
Well, nothing that goes beyond our native cognitive capacities. Just like you can't turn the visual system into an insect system.
Well, I mean, the thought is perhaps you can't directly, but you can map.
You could, but we know that without this experiment.
Right.
You could map what a bee sees and present it in a form so that we could follow it. In fact, every bee scientist does that.
Mm-hmm. But you don't think there's something greater than bees that we can map and then all of a sudden discover something, be able to understand a quantum world, quantum mechanics, be able to start to be able to make sense.
Students at MIT study and understand quantum mechanics.
But they always reduce it to the infant, the physical. I mean, they don't really understand it.
Oh, there's that may be another area where there's just a limit to understanding. We understand the theories, but the world that it describes doesn't make any sense. So, the experiment, Schrödinger's cat, for example, can understand the theory, but as Schrödinger pointed out, it's an unintelligible world. One of the reasons why Einstein was always very skeptical about quantum theory. He described himself as a classical realist in one's intelligibility.
He has something in common with infants in that way. So, back to linguistics. If you could humor me. Okay, so let me ask you about these super intelligent cortical systems that we engineer and us humans. Do you think with these entities operating out there in the world, what does the future, most promising future look like? Is it us merging with them? Or is it us, like how do we keep us humans around when you have increasingly intelligent beings? Is it one of the dreams is to upload our minds in the digital space?
Yeah.
So can we just give our minds to these systems so they can operate on them?
Yeah.
Is there some kind of more interesting merger or is there more
So in the third part of my book, I talked about all these scenarios and let me just walk through them.
Sure.
The uploading the mind one.
Yes.
Extremely, really difficult to do. Like we have no idea how to do this, even remotely right now. So it would be a very long way away. But I make the argument you wouldn't like the result. And you wouldn't be pleased with the result. It's really not what you think it's going to be. Imagine I could upload your brain into a computer right now. And now the computer's sitting there going, hey, I'm over here. Great. Get rid of that old bio person. I don't need him. You're still sitting here.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? No, that's not me. I'm here, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to feel satisfied in that? Then but people imagine, look, I'm on my deathbed and I'm about to, expire, and I push the button and now I'm uploaded. But just think about it a little differently. And so I don't think it's going to be a thing because people, by the time we're able to do this, if ever, because you have to replicate the entire body, not just the brain. It's really I walk through the issues. It's really substantial.
Do you have a sense of what makes us us? Is there a shortcut to what can only save a certain part that makes us truly ours?
No, but I think that machine would feel like it's you too.
Right.
Right. You have two people, just like I have a child, right? I have two daughters. Mm-hmm. They're independent people. I created them, partly.
Yeah.
And I don't. Just because they're somewhat like me, I don't feel I'm them and they don't feel like I'm me. So if you split apart, you have two people. So we can come back to what makes what consciousness, if you want. We can talk about that. But we don't have a remote consciousness. I'm not sitting there going, oh, I'm conscious of that. I'm in that system over there. So let's stay on our topic here.
Okay,
so
sure.
One was uploading a brain.
Yep.
Ain't going to happen in 100 years, maybe 1,000, but I don't think people are going to want to do it. The merging your mind with, the Neuralink thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, again, really, really difficult. It's one thing to make progress to control a prosthetic arm. It's another to have like a billion or several billion, things and understanding what those signals mean. Mm-hmm. Like, it's the one thing to like, okay, I can learn to think some patterns to make something happen. It's quite another thing to have a system, a computer, which actually knows exactly which cells it's talking to and how it's talking to them and interacting in a way like that. Very, very difficult. We're not getting anywhere closer to that.
Interesting. Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
So for me, what makes that merger very difficult practically in the next 10, 20, 50 years is like literally the biology side of it, which is like, it's just hard to do that kind of surgery in a safe way.
Yeah.
But your intuition is even the machine learning part of it, where the machine has to learn what the heck it's talking to. That's even hard.
I think it's even harder. And it's easy to do when you're talking about hundreds of signals. It's a totally different thing to say talking about billions of signals.
So you don't think it's it's a machine learning problem? You don't think it could be learned?
No, well, I'm just saying, no, I think you'd have to have detailed knowledge. You'd have to know exactly what the types of neurons you're connecting to. I mean, in the brain, there's the neurons that do all different types of things. It's not like a neural network. It's a very complex organism system up here. We talked about the grid cells earlier, the place cells. You have to know what kind of cells you're talking to and what they're doing and how their timing works and all this stuff, which you can't today. There's no way of doing that, right? But I think the problem, you're right that the biological aspect of it, like who wants to have a surgery and have this stuff, inserted in your brain, that's a problem. But this is when we solve that problem. I think the information coding aspect is much worse. I think that's much worse. It's not like what they're doing today. Today, it's simple machine learning stuff because you're doing simple things. Mm-hmm. But if you want to merge your brain, like I'm thinking on the internet, I'm merge my brain with the machine and we're both doing, that's a totally different issue.
That's interesting. I tend to think if you have a super clean signal from a bunch of neurons at the start, you don't know what those neurons are. I think that's much easier than the getting of the clean signal.
Yeah, I think if you think about today's machine learning, that's what you would conclude.
Right.
I'm thinking about what's going on in the brain, and I don't reach that conclusion. So we'll have to see.
Sure.
But I don't think even then, I think there's kind of a sad future. Like, do I have to like plug my brain into a computer? I'm still a biological organism. Mm-hmm. I assume I'm still going to die. So what have I achieved? Right? What have I achieved to doing some sort of...
Oh, I disagree. We don't know what those are, but it seems like there could be a lot of different applications. It's like virtual reality is to expand your brain's capability to read Wikipedia.
Yeah, but fine. But you're still a biological organism.
Yes. You're still mortal. You're still
all right.
All of those things.
What are you accomplishing? You're making your life in this short period of time better, right?
Just like having the internet made our life better. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's if I think about all the possible gains we can have here, that's a marginal one. It's an individual. Hey, I'm better. I'm smarter. But fine. I'm not against it. I just don't think it's earth changing.
So this is the true of the internet. When each of us individuals are smarter, we get a chance to then share our smartness. We get smarter and smarter together as a collective. This is kind of like this ant colony of intelligence.
But why don't I just create an intelligent machine that doesn't have any of this biological nonsense? That has all the same. It's everything except don't burden it with my brain.
Yeah.
Right? It has a brain. It is smart. It's like my child, but it's much, much smarter than me. So I have a choice between doing some implant, doing some hybrid weird, biological thing that's bleeding and all these problems and limited by my brain, or creating a system which is super smart that I can talk to, that helps me understand the world, that can read the internet, read Wikipedia and talk to me.
I guess so there's a guy named Elon Musk, and he has a company, one of the many companies called Neuralink, that has that's also excited about the brain. So it'd be interesting to hear your kind of opinions about a very different approach that's invasive, that requires surgery, that implants a data collection device in the brain. How do you think about the difference between kernel and Neuralink in the approaches of getting that stream of brain data?
Elon and I spoke about this a lot early on. We met up. I had started kernel, and he had an interest in brain interfaces as well. And we explored doing something together, him joining kernel. And ultimately, it wasn't the right move. And so he started Neuralink, and I continued building kernel. But it was interesting because we were both at this very early time where it wasn't certain if there was a path to pursue, if now was the right time to do something, and then the technological choice of doing that. And so we were both, our starting point was looking at invasive technologies. And I was building invasive technology at the time. That's ultimately where he's gone. little less than a year after Elon and I were engaged, I shifted Kernel to do non-invasive. And we had this neuroscientist come to Kernel. We were talking about, he had been doing neurosurgery for 30 years, one of the most respected neuroscientists in the US. And we brought him to Kernel to figure out the ins and outs of his profession. Mm-hmm. And at the very end of our 3-hour conversation, he said, you know, every 15 or so years, a new technology comes along that changes everything. He said, it's probably already here. You just can't see it yet. And my jaw dropped. I thought, because I had spoken to Bob Greenberg, who had built Second Sight, first on the optical nerve, and then he did an array on the optical cortex. And then I also became friendly with NeuroPace, who does the implants for seizure detection and remediation. And I saw in their eyes what it was like to take something through an implantable device through for a 15-year run. They initially thought it 7 years, and it ended up being 15 years, and they thought it'd be 100 million, is 300, 400 million. And I really didn't want to build invasive technology. It was the only thing that appeared to be possible. But then once I spun up an internal effort to start looking at non-invasive options, we said, is there something here? Is there anything here that, again, has the characteristics of, it has the high quality data, it could be low cost, it could be accessible. Could it make brain interfaces mainstream? And so I did a bet the company move. We shifted from non-invasive to invasive to non-invasive.
So the answer is yes to that. There is something there. It's possible.
The answer is we'll see. We've now built both technologies, and they're now, you experience one of them today. We were applying. We're now deploying it, so we're trying to figure out what value is really there. But I'd say it's really too early to express confidence. I think it's too early to assess which technological choice is the right one on what timescales.
Yeah, timescales are really important here.
Very
right?
important, because if you look at on the invasive side, there's so much activity going on right now of less invasive techniques to get at the neuron firings, which what Neuralink is building. It's possible that in 10, 15 years, when they're scaling that technology, other things have come along, and you'd much rather do that. That then starts the clock again. It may not be the case. It may be the case that Neuralink has properly chosen the right technology, and that's exactly where they want to be. Totally possible. And it's also possible that the path we've chosen at non-invasive falls short for a variety of reasons. It's unknown. And so right now, the two technologies we chose, the analogy I'd give you to create a baseline of understanding is, if you think of it like the internet in the 90s, the internet became useful when people could do a dial-up connection. And then as bandwidth increased, so did the utility of that connection, and so did the ecosystem improve. And so if you say what kernel flow is going to give you a full screen on the picture of information, so you're going to be watching a movie, but the image is going to be blurred and the audio is going to be muffled. So it has a lower resolution of coverage. Kernel Flux, our MEG technology, is going to give you the full movie in 1080p.
Yeah.
And Neuralink is going to give you a circle on the screen of 4K.
Yeah.
And so each one has their pros and cons, and it's give and take. And so the decision I made at Kernel was that these two technologies, Flux and Flow, were basically the answer for the next 7 years.
Yeah.
And that they would give rise to the ecosystem, which would become much more valuable than the hardware itself, and that we would just continue to improve on the hardware over time. And, it's early days. So
it's kind of fascinating to think about that. It's very true that you don't know. Both paths are very promising. And it's like 50 years from now, we will look back and maybe not even remember one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one might change the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's so cool how technology is. I mean, that's what entrepreneurship is. It's like, it's the zeroth principle. It's like you're marching ahead into the darkness, into the fog, not knowing.
It's wonderful to have someone else out there with us doing this. Because if you look at brain interfaces, anything that's off the shelf right now is inadequate. It's had its run for a couple decades. It's still in hacker communities. It hasn't gone to the mainstream. The room-sized machines are on their own path. But there is no answer right now of bringing brain interfaces mainstream. And so both they and us, we've both spent over $100 million. And that's kind of what it takes to have a go at this, because you need to build full stack. I mean, at Kernel, we are from the photon and the atom through the machine learning. We have just under 100 people. I think it's something like 36, 37 PhDs in these specialties, in these areas that there's only a few people in the world who have these abilities. And that's what it takes to build next generation, to make an attempt at breaking into brain interfaces. And so we'll see over the next couple of years whether it's the right time or whether we were both too early, or whether something else comes along in 7 to 10 years, which is the right thing that brings it mainstream.
So do you see Elon as a kind of competitor or a fellow traveler along the path of uncertainty, or both?
It's a fellow traveler. It's like at the beginning of the internet is how many companies are going to be invited to this new ecosystem? Like an endless number. Because if you think the hardware just starts the process. And so back to your initial example, if you take the Fitbit, for example, you say, okay, now I can get measurements on the body. And what do we think the ultimate value of this device is going to be? What is the information transfer rate? And they were in the market for a certain duration of time, and Google bought them for $2.5 billion. They didn't have ancillary value add. There weren't people building on top of the Fitbit device. They also didn't have increased insight with additional data streams. So it's really just the device. If you look, for example, at Apple and the device they sell, you have value in the device that someone buys, but also you have everyone who's building on top of it. So you have this additional ecosystem value, and then you have additional data streams that come in which increase the value of the product. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the hardware as the instigator of value creation, mm-hmm. Over time, what we've built may constitute 5 or 10% of the value of the overall ecosystem. And that's what we really care about. What we're trying to do is kickstart the mainstream adoption of quantifying the brain. And the hardware just opens the door to say what kind of ecosystem could exist. Mm. And that's why the examples are so relevant of the things you've outlined in your life. I hope those things, the books people write, the experiences people build, the conversations you have, your relationship with your AI systems, I hope those all are feeding on the insights built upon this ecosystem we've created to better your life. And so that's the thinking behind it, again, with the Drake equation being the underlying driver of value. And the people at Kernel have joined not because we have certainty of success, but because we find it to be the most exhilarating opportunity we could ever pursue in this time to be alive.
Over there.
And a small tangent, what are your thoughts in this broader definition of drugs, of psychedelics, of mind-altering things? What are your thoughts about Neuralink and brain-computer interfaces, sort of being able to electrically stimulate and read neuronal activity in the brain and then connect that to the computer, which is another way, from a computational perspective for me, is kind of appealing, but it's another way of altering subtly the behavior of the brain that's kind of, if you zoom out, reminiscent of the way psychedelics do as well.
Right.
So what do you have? Like, what are your thoughts about Neuralink? What are your hopes as a researcher of mind-altering devices, systems, chemicals?
I guess broadly speaking, I'm all for it. I mean, for the same reason I am with psychedelics, but it comes with all the caveats. You're going into a brave new world where it's like all of a sudden there's going to be a dark side. There's going to be, the serious ethical considerations, but that should not stop us from moving there. I mean, particularly the stuff from, and I'm no expert, but on the short list in the short term, it's like, yeah, can we help these serious neurological disorders? Like, hell yeah. Like, and I'm also sensitive to something being someone that has lots of, neuroscience colleagues. With some of the stuff, and I can't talk about particulars, I'm not recalling, but, in terms of, stuff getting out there and then kind of a mocking of oh gosh, they're saying this is unique. We know this, or sort of like this belittling of like, oh, this sounds like it's just a commercialization or like an oversimple. I forget what the example was, but something like something that came off to some of my neuroscientific colleagues as an oversimplification, or at least the way they said it.
Oh, from a Neuralink perspective.
Right. Oh, we've known that for years.
Yes,
and but I'm very sympathetic to like, maybe it's because of my very limited, but relatively speaking, the amount of exposure the psychedelic work has had to my limited experience of being out there. And then you think about someone like Musk, who's like really, really out there, and you just get all these arrows that like, and it's hard to be like, when you're plowing new ground, like you're going to get criticized, like every little word that you, like this balance between speaking to like people to make it meaningful, something scientists aren't very good at.
Yes.
Having people understand what you're saying, and then being belittled by oversimplifying something in terms of the public message. So I'm extremely sympathetic, and I'm a big fan of like what Elon Musk does, like tunnels through the ground and SpaceX and all this. Just like, hell yeah. Like this guy has some great ideas.
And there's something to be said. It's not just the communication to the public. I think his first principles thinking, it's like, because I get this in the artificial intelligence world, it's probably similar to neuroscience world, where Elon will say something like, I worked at MIT, I worked on autonomous vehicles. And he's sort of, I could sense how much he pisses off like every roboticist at MIT and everybody who works on like the human factor side of safety of autonomous vehicles, in saying like, we don't need to consider human beings in the car. Like the car will drive itself. It's obvious that neural networks is all you need. Like it's obvious that like we should be able to systems that should be able to learn constantly. And they don't really need LiDAR. They just need cameras, because we humans just use our eyes, and that's the same as cameras. So like why would we need anything else? And you just have to make a system that learns faster and faster and faster. And neural networks can do that. And so that's pissing off every single community. It's pissing off human factors community, saying you don't need to consider the human driver in the picture. You can just focus on the robotics problem. It's pissing off every robotics person for saying LiDAR can be just ignored. It can be camera. Every robotics person knows that camera is really noisy. That's really difficult to deal with. But and then every AI person who hears neural networks and says like neural networks can learn everything, like almost presuming that it's kind of going to achieve general intelligence. The problem with all those haters in the three communities is that they're looking 1 year ahead, 5 years ahead. The hilarious thing about the quote unquote ridiculous things that Elon Musk is saying is they have a pretty good shot at being true in 20 years. And so like when you just look at when you look at the progression of these kinds of predictions, and sometimes first principles thinking can allow you to do that, is you see that it's kind of obvious that things are going to progress this way. And if you just remove the prejudice you hold about the particular battles of the current academic environment, and just look at the big picture of the progression of the technology, you can usually see the world in the same kind of way. And so in that same way, looking at psychedelics, you can see like there is so many exciting possibilities here if we fully engage in the research. Same thing with Neuralink. If we fully engage, so we go from 1,000 channels of communication to the brain to billions of channels of communication to the brain, and we figure out many of the details of how to do that safely with neurosurgery and so on, that the world would just change completely in the same kind of way that Elon is. It's so ridiculous to hear him talk about symbiotic relationship between AI and the human brain, but it's like, is it though? Like is it? Because I can see in 50 years that's going to be an obvious, like everyone will have Like, obviously you have, like, why are we typing stuff in the computer? It doesn't make any sense. That's stupid.
Like,
people used to type on a keyboard with a mouse. What is that? So,
and it seems pretty clear, like, we're going to be there.
Yeah.
Like, and the only question is, like, what's the time frame? Is that going to be 20 or is it 50 or 100? Like, how could we not?
And the thing that I guess upsets with Elon and others is the timeline he tends to do. I think a lot of people tend to do that kind of thing. I definitely do it, which is like, it'll be done this year versus like, it'll be done in 10 years. See, the timeline is a little bit too rushed, but from a leadership perspective, it inspires the engineers to do the best work of their life, to really kind of believe, because to do the impossible, you have to first believe it, which is a really important aspect of innovation.
And there's the delay discounting aspect I talked about before. It's like saying, oh, this is going to be a thing 20, 50 years from now. It's like, what motivates anybody? If you could, and even if you're fudging it or like wishful thinking a little bit, or let's just say erring on one side of the probability distribution, like there's value in saying like, like there's a chance we could get this done in a year. And you know what? And if you set a goal for a year and you're not successful, hey, you might get it done in 3 years. Whereas if you had aimed at 20 years, well, you either would have never done it at all, or you would have aimed at 20 years and then would have taken you 10. So there. And the other thing I think about this, like in terms of his work, and I guess we've seen with psychedelics, is like there's a lack of appreciation for like sort of the variability you need in natural selection, sort of extrapolating from biological, from evolution. Like, hey, maybe he's wrong about focusing only on the cameras and not these other things. Be empirically driven. It's like, you need to, like, when he's, when you need to get the regulation, is it safe enough to get this thing on the road? Those are real questions. And be empirically driven. And if he can meet the whatever standard is relevant, that's the standard, and be driven by that. So don't let it affect your ethics. But if he's on the wrong path, how wonderful. Someone's exploring that wrong path. He's going to figure out it's a wrong path. And like other people, damn it, he's doing something. Yeah. Like he's, and so appreciating that variability, that like it's valuable even if he's not on. I mean, this is all over the place in science. It's like a good theory. One standard definition is that it generates testable hypotheses. And like the ultimate model is never going to be the same as reality. Some models are going to work better than others. Like, Newtonian physics got us a long ways, even if there was a better model like waiting. And some models weren't as good as, were never that successful, but just even like putting them out there and testing, we wouldn't know something is a bad model until someone puts it out anyway. So
diversity of ideas is essential for progress. Yeah. What do you think, just on that topic? There's been a lot of exciting innovation in brain-computer interfaces. I don't know if you're familiar with the companies like Neuralink with Elon Musk, communicating both ways, from a computer being able to activate neurons and being able to read spikes from neurons, with the dream of being able to expand, sort of increase the bandwidth at which your brain can like look up articles on Wikipedia, kind of thing. Sort of expand the knowledge capacity of the brain. Do you think that notion is that interesting to you as the expansion of the human mind?
Yes, that's very interesting. I'd love to be able to have that increased bandwidth. And I want better access to my memory, I have to say, too. As I get older, I talk to my wife about things that we did 20 years ago or something. Her memory is often better about particular events. Where were we? Who was at that event? What did he or she wear even? She may know, and I have not the faintest idea about this. But perhaps it's somewhere in my memory. And if I had this extended memory, I could search that particular year and rerun those things. I think that would be great.
In some sense, we already have that by storing so much of our data online, like pictures of different events.
Yes, well, Gmail is fantastic for that because people email me as if they know me well, and I haven't got a clue who they are. But then I search for their name, and yes, they emailed me in 2007, That's right. And I know who they are now.
Yeah, so we're taking the first steps already.
For a minute.
I got a chance to witness Neuralink. I don't know if you're familiar with that company, the brain-computer interfaces. And then I got a chance to see in person just a bunch of pigs who had Neuralink chips implanted and taken out. And those pigs are so happy with life. I don't know. I've never seen a happier animal. I mean, because they get to eat. Because you were mentioning sort of diets and stuff. Pigs seem to love a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They're easily made to be happy. I don't know if you can comment on your thoughts of exploring the capacity of the pig mind through some of this testing with Neuralink. Whether that's exciting to you, whether maybe on the humane side it's a little bit concerning. If there's something to be said on sort of like, I don't know if it's even the ethical side, but just because of your connection to meat and to nature and understanding these living beings.
Well, pigs are incredibly intelligent, so yes. I'm not surprised that they're a subject matter for Neuralink. They're smarter than dogs, and they're empathetic and emotional, and we'll go look at our pigs afterwards and see, but they're kind of like joyful and exuberant when they're in good health. Mm-hmm. And so that makes sense. I'm interested and open. I feel that the kind of bleeding edge agriculture movement that I'm, on the edge of in some ways, we're a larger operator, but we as a movement have to get into the game. We have to move forward in a way that allows us to scale if we want to be viable. Mm-hmm. So I think there has to be openness to how that can happen. Yeah. And I also think there needs to be more thoughtful and noisy data about how regenerative ranching can sequester carbon. Mm-hmm. I mean, thousands of American ranches are selling carbon credits right now. The data is that valid. And they're not selling carbon credits from like grassland that just got a fence around it. Mm-hmm. They're selling carbon credits for verified data from animals assisting in carbon sequestration. Right? So there's got to be a way to get the tech community involved in ways to help regenerative agriculture scale. In different creative ways. And actually, that'd be interesting if like Neuralink somehow has, especially because Elon Musk is involved and Kimball Musk is has his whole effort and appreciation of regenerative agriculture, that I wonder if Neuralink has a role to play. Like exploring the neurobiology of the animal, if that somehow will create innovations that lead to improved scaling of regenerative agriculture. That'd be interesting. But you're saying you should be open to all those possibilities. I don't know the landscape to know what. Yeah. But my sense is that it's very hard. It's very hard. And our farming operation to scale, it's been incredibly complex and challenging. We now work with partner farms. I see their operations. They're incredibly complex. It just seems like there's got to be a way to make some of these things simpler and easier to share information. Yeah. I don't know what that answer is. What would be cool is if we can understand deeper ways to measure the happiness of an animal. Because then we can optimize, like certified humane could be literally an optimization problem. Just make sure, as opposed to kind of projecting our own human values, actually measuring what the animal is happy doing. That could be, so understanding the pig brain might help us understand pig happiness and like reframe what it means for a happy animal. And then maybe it's a lot easier to make the animal happy than we think. Mm-hmm. And it might have to do with a variety of delicious food in the case of the pig. I have to ask you about the wizard hat. You wrote a blog about Neuralink. I got a chance to visit Neuralink a couple of times, hanging out with those folks. That was one of the pieces of writing you did that like changes culture and changes the way people think about a thing. The ridiculousness of your stick figure drawings are somehow it's like calling the origin of the universe the Big Bang. It's a silly title, but it somehow sticks to be the representative of that. In the same way, the wizard hat for the Neuralink is somehow was a really powerful way to explain that. You actually proposed that the Man of the Year cover of Time should be
one of my drawings. One of your drawings. In general,
It's an outrage that it wasn't.
It wasn't.
Okay. So, what are your thoughts about like all those years later about Neuralink? Do you find this idea, like what excites you about it? Is it the big long-term philosophical things? Is it the practical things? Do you think it's super difficult to do on the neurosurgery side and the material engineering, the robotics side? Or do you think, the machine learning side for the brain-computer interfaces where they get to learn about each other, all that kind of stuff? I would just love to get your thoughts because you're one of the people that really considered this problem, really studied it, of brain-computer interfaces.
I mean, I'm super excited about it. I really think it's actually Elon's most ambitious thing, more than colonizing Mars, because that's just a bunch of people going somewhere, even though it's somewhere far. Neuralink is changing what a person is, eventually. Now, I think that Neuralink engineers and Elon himself would all be the first to admit that it is a maybe that whether they can do their goals here. I mean, it is so crazy ambitious to try to. Their eventual goals are, of course, in the interim, they have a higher probability of accomplishing smaller things, which are still huge, like basically solving paralysis, strokes, Parkinson, things like that. I mean, it can be unbelievable, and anyone who doesn't have one of these things, like we might, everyone should be very happy about this kind of helping with different disabilities. But the thing that is like, so the grand goal is this augmentation, where you take someone who's totally healthy and you put a brain machine interface in any way to give them superpowers. It's the possibilities if they can do this, if they can really. So, they've already shown that they are for real. With they've created this robot. Elon talks about like it should be like LASIK, where it's not. It shouldn't be something that needs a surgeon. This shouldn't just be for rich people who have waited in line for 6 months. It should be for anyone who can afford LASIK, and eventually, hopefully, something that isn't covered by insurance, or something that anyone can do. Something this big a deal should be something that anyone can afford eventually. And when we have this, again, I'm talking about a very advanced phase down the road. So maybe a less advanced phase, maybe right now, if you think about when you listen to a song, what's happening is, do you actually hear the sound? Well, not really. It's that the sound is coming out of the speaker. The speaker is vibrating. It's vibrating air molecules. Those air molecules, get vibrated all the way to your head, the pressure wave, and then it vibrates your eardrum. Your eardrum is really the speaker now in your head that then vibrates bones and fluid, which then stimulates neurons in your auditory cortex, which give you the perception that you're hearing sound. Now, if you think about that, do we really need to have a speaker to do that? You could just somehow, if you had a little tiny thing that could vibrate eardrums, you could do it that way. That seems very hard. But really what you need, if you go to the very end, but the thing that really needs to happen is your auditory cortex neurons need to be stimulated in a certain way. If you have a ton of Neuralink things in there, Neuralink electrodes, and they get really good at stimulating things, you could play a song in your head that you hear that is not playing anywhere. There's no sound in the room, but you hear it, and no one else could. And it's not like they can get close to your head and hear it. There's no sound. They could not hear anything, but you hear sound. You can turn up. So you open your phone. You have the Neuralink app. You open the Neuralink app, or just Neuralink. So basically, you can open your Spotify and you can play to, you can play to your speaker. You can play to your computer. You can play right out of your phone to your headphones, or you now have a new one. You can play into your brain. And this is one of the earlier things. This is, something that seems like really doable. So, no more headphones. I always think it's so annoying because I can leave the house with just my phone, and nothing else, or even just an Apple Watch. But there's always this one thing. I'm like, and headphones. You do need your headphones, right? So I feel like, that'll be the end of that. But there's so many things that and you keep going, the ability to think together. You can talk about like super brains. I mean, one of the examples Elon uses is the low bandwidth of speech. If I go to a movie and I come out of a scary movie and you say, how was it? I said, it was terrifying. Well, what did I just do? I had 5 buckets I could have given you. One was horrifying, terrifying, scary, eerie, creepy, whatever. That's about it. And I had a much more nuanced experience than that. And all I have is, these words, right? And so instead I just hand you the bucket. I put the stuff in the bucket and give it to you, but all you have is the bucket. You just have to guess what I put into that bucket. All you can do is look at the label of the bucket and say, when I say terrifying, here's what I mean. So the point is, it's very lossy. I have all this nuanced information of what I thought of the movie, and I'm sending you a very low res package that you're going to now guess what the high res thing looked like. That's language in general. Our thoughts are much more nuanced. If we can think to each other, we can do amazing things. We could have a brainstorm that doesn't feel like, oh, we're not talking in each other's heads. It's not just that I hear your voice. No. We are just thinking. No words are being said internally or externally. The two brains are literally collaborating. It's a skill. I'm sure we'd have to get good at it. I'm sure young kids will be great at it and old people will be bad.
Yeah.
But you think together, and together you have the joint epiphany. And now how about 8 people in a room doing it, right? So it gets, there's other examples. How about when you're a dress designer or a bridge designer and you want to show people what your dress looks like? Well, right now you got to sketch it for a long time. Here, just beam it onto the screen from your head so you can picture it. If you can picture a tree in your head, well, you can just suddenly whatever's in your head, you can be pictured. So we'll have to get very good at it, right? It's going to take a skill, right? You're going to have to. But the possibilities, my God, talk about I feel like if that works, if we really do have that as something, I think it'll almost be like a new ADBC line. It's such a big change that the idea of anyone living before everyone had brain-machine interfaces is living in before the common era. It's that level of big change if it can work.
Yeah, and the replay of memories, just replaying stuff in your head.
Oh my God, yeah. And copying, you can hopefully copy memories onto other things and you don't have to just rely on your wet circuitry.
It does make me sad because you're right. The brain is incredibly neuroplastic, and so it can adjust. It can learn how to do this. I think it'll be a skill. But probably you and I will be too old to truly learn.
Maybe we can there'll be great trainings. I'm spending the next 3 months in one of the Neuralink trainings.
But it'll still be a bit of grandpa can't.
Definitely. This is, I always think, how am I going to be old? I'm no, I'm going to be great at the new phones. It's not going to be the phones. It's going to be the kid's going to be thinking to me. And I'm going to be can you just talk, please? And they're going to be okay, I'll just talk. And they're going to. So that'll be the equivalent of, yelling to your grandpa today.
I really suspect, I don't know what your thoughts are, but